Brett Bell was finishing up making a tuna salad sandwich using his wife's recipe, and wishing for the 10th time that day that she was still around, when the doorbell rang. Pausing only to cut the sandwich in half, ready for some good eatin' later, as she would have put it with exaggerated accent, and wipe his hands on a kitchen towel, he walked to the door, wondering who was there, at midday on a Sunday. He wasn't aware of any Amazon deliveries, and it was a little early in the day for the Mormon missionaries who were currently targeting his neighborhood. Given it was Sunday, he doubted he'd see any other human at all, unless he chose to go out, so a ring on the door was unusual. When he opened the door, he saw two youngsters, as his father would have put it, God rest his soul, standing looking expectantly. One male, one female. Both had light blonde hair, and they were obviously brother and sister. The family similarities were obvious. Both wore hesitant smiles, the hopeful kind, where a good first impression is desired. But what caused him to start in shock was when he looked in their eyes. One brown eye and one blue each, just like his. And when the lady said with a distinct British accent, "Hello, Dad, it's nice to meet you," it was the moment he collapsed. "Are you sure you are okay?" said Amelia, looking very concerned. Brett was on the couch in his living room, head in his hands, trying to comprehend what was happening. Amelia was hovering over him, the same kitchen towel he'd wiped his hands on, now wet and pressed into service, dabbing his forehead. "I told you, I'm fine," Brett replied, some steel in his voice. "You just took me by surprise, that's all." "Told you we should have rung him up first," said the man. Bradley, he had introduced himself as, right after they'd helped him up off the doorstep and into the house. Both were decidedly British. That same clipped and clear accent that Brett associated with Downton Abbey and, of course, Fiona. Or using her full title, the Lady Fiona Birmingham Hart, daughter of the Duke of Ipswich. But here they were. He'd had some suspicions, of course. The timing had seemed right, but he'd never reach out and ask. That had been the agreement, and he wasn't going to break it. He knew, like she did, there was no future, no chance. She was trapped where she was, and he was powerless to get her out. She had commitments, responsibilities, duty. He knew that, and he loved her enough to leave her alone when she asked. No contact. As he'd agreed, no matter how unwillingly. He knew that his heart would unlikely survive another encounter anyway. Best to live and let live. Or in his case, live and let love. He'd nursed his broken heart for years. New places, new occupations, new relationships, if only temporary, until he'd met Caroline. She, as it turned out, was as damaged emotionally as he was. They'd clung together, two pieces of flotsam in a tsunami of life, holding on to each other for dear life, and making a life together. It was never a relationship dominated by passion, more a comfort. He'd loved her, and he was sure she loved him. But it was a relationship of convenience and attraction, not a white-hot passion like he'd had with her, if only for 10 days. And now here they were, the children he would never have. He moved his hands and looked up. He had to cope. Deal with this, however unexpected. He smiled at them ruefully, and they looked down at him, concern on their faces. The crease in Brady's face, one he'd seen in the mirror more than once. He glanced at Amelia and was struck again by how much she resembled her mother. "I'm really sorry, I'm not normally that much of a wuss. You really caught me by surprise. I'm okay now, just getting on a bit." Amelia snorted and then sat down, saying, "You are 51, Dad. You are barely begun yet. Strong as an ox, so Mother says." "I think he needs a drink," said Bradley, looking around the house, great room to locate interesting bottles. His eyes lit up when he saw the small collection on the side table. It was an eclectic grouping, a bottle from every country he'd visited while he'd been in the Merchant Marine, plus some top-end blended Irish and Scottish whiskies. He'd never worked out if it was whiskey without an E or whiskey with a E. It seemed to change depending on the nationality of whomever he was talking to at the time. "I know I do," he added, walking to the table to examine the different bottles. "You think everyone needs a drink?" exclaimed Amelia, and then glancing at Brett, her expression softened. "Mind you, in this situation, we could all probably use some mother's ruin, even if the sun isn't over the yardarm yet." "You look so like your mother," said Brett, wistfully. He suddenly gathered his wits and stood. "But my manners. You show up and I've offered you nothing. It's lunchtime, I was about to have a sandwich. Can I offer you something?" Bradley looked over from the drinks table, looking pensive. "What are you having?" "Bradley!" said Amelia sharply. "What? If it's something good, I'm definitely in. I'm all still messed up from all that jet lag. What you got, Dad?" "Dad? Who the hell was that? Oh yeah, him," Brett thought. "Tuna sandwich. It's Caroline's recipe. Tuna, mixed with mayo, sprinkled with sweet corn and green onion. Tastes great." "Oh yes, that sounds marvellous," said Bradley, smiling widely at Brett. "Definitely up for some of that." "Amelia?" inquired Brett, looking down at his daughter. "I'm sorry. Should I call you Amelia? Do you prefer anything else?" Amelia smiled wide at him, the same wide smile Bradley. Genuine, and showing big teeth, with a tiny gap between the two front teeth, just like her mother. "My family calls me Millie," she said hesitantly. "I'd really like it if you did too." Brett's shoulders dropped at her obvious and genuine desire, and suddenly she was on her feet and in his arms, hugging him for all he was worth. "I'm sorry. We didn't know who you were. We didn't even know you existed. Mother only told us a few weeks ago, and it took so long to find you. I'm sorry. We just want to know you. To know who you are." The words came out thick and fast, interspersed with sobs. "It's okay, Millie. You are here now. I'm the one who should apologise. I wasn't there. There was a reason, and I'm sure your mother explained. But please, let me..." Suddenly there was another arm wrapped around him, and Bradley was in on the hug. He was wordless, a few tears coming down his face, belaying the disinterested hard man impression he'd been trying so hard to maintain. "We have all the time in the world to catch up. You are here now," murmured Brett, wondering how his life was going to be going forward. Well, it couldn't be any worse. Lunch completed, Brett finished off his beer and burped contentedly. Suddenly realising not only his guest but their place in society, he pursed his lips and looked away. Then he looked back. He was damned if he was going to be made to feel inferior in his own house by his own children, regardless of who raised them or what position they may feel they had. Amelia looked on amused, and when Bradley burped in almost the exact same fashion, he laughed. These were definitely his children. Pretending to be disgusted, Amelia turned away. "Men, such pigs. Did we at least wash our hands before sticking both trotters in the trough? At least I know where he gets that from." Bradley looked at Brett and spread his hands in a "what can you do" gesture, and Brett winked back. "I'm just glad it wasn't a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I mean, that's what you Americans eat, isn't it?" Amelia announced, looking back at Brett. "Well, on occasion. Have you never had one? I'm sure I have some here somewhere," replied Brett, hamming up the accent. She just smiled back, and Bradley finished his beer, making lip-smacking noises. "You know, they look down on your Yank beers back home. But this was rather good, have to say. What was that?" "Anchor Steam, made up in San Francisco. It's a favourite of mine." "I think we may have to look into grabbing a case before we head back," said Bradley, appreciatively. "So," said Amelia, getting up and gathering up their plates, "I suspect you'd like to know why we are here, why Mother finally told us about you." "I'm guessing it's because of the death of the Duke," hazarded Brett, eyes following Amelia as she deposited the plates in his kitchen sink, and then as she wandered to the fridge to gather new bottles of the beer for all three of them. "Indeed," replied Bradley, nodding to Amelia as she handed him a bottle. "Mum finally came clean after the funeral. On learning of your existence, we looked at her reports on you, had to do some research to find your current abode, and hopped on a plane as quick as we could. We had to meet the man who..." He didn't finish the statement, going a little red. "Yeah," said Brett dryly. He was not about to have that talk with his children. "I suppose you want to know the story?" "Among other things, for sure. We have other stuff we want to know, obviously. I mean, for example, any hereditary stuff we should know? Do we have a history of heart disease, for example?" Amelia was right to the point. It made Brett chuckle. Another one of his own traits on display. "Not that I'm aware of. The only thing I know about is the skipped generation of insanity. I mean, Uncle Tom and Dad both died in an asylum. That's happened for 5 generations now, skips every other. It should be hitting your generation, I think. Mad cow or something." There was silence for a moment. Then both Amelia and Bradley burst out into laughter. "Oh, very good. Very droll. You almost had me going there for a moment," laughed Amelia. Unable to keep a straight face, Brett joined the laughter. It felt good. It was unforced and just spontaneous. There hadn't been a lot of that recently, not since Caroline died. "But yes, we'd like to hear it. Mother didn't tell us much, just that you were the best 10 days of her life, as she put it." Amelia made quote motions with her fingers and then rolled her eyes. The concept of Mother having passion-filled days at sea is honestly both off-putting and also quite hard to believe. She's never been one for large displays of passion, except when one of us is threatened. Telling us this story about you was quite the shock, let me tell you. "Shall we sit in the living room? Comfortable chairs there and the view is terrific," asked Brett, wondering how much he should really tell them. How much do children really want to hear about their parents' love life? "Yes, let's," replied Amelia, rising, Bradley following. They took their drinks into the great room, with its massive bank of floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the cliff and into the Pacific Ocean, calm and flat as the eye could see, clouds rolling over the top of it. Distantly, breakers could be seen rolling in, and surfers trying to catch a wave in their wetsuits in the post-midday sun. The North San Diego surfing grounds in all their splendour. "Nice view," nodded Bradley at the bay windows as they settled into a couch and easy chair arranged for peak view. Brett shrugged. He'd never tired of it, but he'd grown accustomed to it over the years, hardly noticing some days. When there was a storm, though, it was one of his favourite things to do, to sit in the easy chair and watch the lighting fork and the seas roll. More than once he'd woken late at night, with a blanket over him, where Caroline had tucked him and left him to his fascination and memories, a glass of Jameson on the table within easy reach, alongside a large glass of water. Something occurred. "You said reports that your mother had?" "Yes," replied Bradley. "She looked in on you every other year or so, just to catch up with where you were, how you were doing. I don't think she ever stopped loving you, to be honest. When she talked about you, she was more animated in years. Apparently you were somewhat hard to find when you moved on from Chicago. I'm not entirely surprised to hear it. I figured she was doing something like that. When I got married to Caroline, we got a wedding gift from an anonymous benefactor. When we signed for the package and opened it, there was no note. Just 5 diamonds. Good ones, too. They paid most of the down payment on this place, in fact. I figured then it must have been her, reaching out in her own way. No direct contact, but still. Brett took a long slug of his beer to mask his feelings. When it had arrived and it had dawned on him the likely origin of the outrageous gift, he'd been very hard-pressed not to reach out. But his promise. Both to Fiona and also the promises he'd made to his new wife. It wouldn't have been appropriate or right for anyone. He'd been unsettled for days, though. "Did you tell your wife where you thought they came from?" asked Amelia, curious. She was sitting at the end of the couch, her legs tucked up under her, moving some stray blonde hair from her face and tucking it behind her ear. So like her mother, it almost burned Brett. He looked away to keep his own control. "Yes. We had no secrets. She knew of my broken heart. She was similarly afflicted, if your mother's reports didn't mention that. We were both of a same mould, and we helped each other become whole. Whoever your mother was to me, Caroline was too. I don't know I would have made it to this age without her and her love and acceptance. I respected her too much to lie, and she understood. She did. It was amazing. Caroline's ability to look beyond the broken to the rest was amazing. She pulled me out of my own self-destructive cycle, and I owe her a lot. Everything, in fact. I'm sorry. We didn't come here to disrespect her or your relationship, Dad. I know we came out of the blue. Out of the past, so to speak, but we are just grateful to be here. We know you have a life, and we aren't here to try and drag you anywhere, just to know you. Bradley was concerned at the emphatic nature of how Brett spoke. Oh, it's okay. Son. There. He said it. This was his son. How the hell did Dad's work anyway? He had no clue. I have had a life since your mother, and I won't apologise for it. Caroline was important and amazing, and we built a great life together. But she's gone now, and I have to make a new life now. One without her. But I'll never forget her or what she did or what she meant. There was silence for a bit after that statement. The quiet and distant roll of the ocean waves and the gentle ticking of a mantel clock, all that could be heard. Brett could tell that both children were groping for what to say next. They wanted to hear about their mother, and he could tell, so he made it easy on them. But your mother was special too, in ways I can't even begin to tell, unless you've been in love like that. Well, so, how did you meet? Brett closed his eyes for a moment, and unbidden, a memory of Fiona popped up, clad in just his shirt, all prim and proper, and yet devastatingly seductive. A bottle of cheap wine in one hand, a plastic wine glass in the other, standing in the doorway of his cabin where anyone might walk past. Her head tilted against the doorframe as she said, "See anything you like, sailor," and then began to talk. I was 26. I'd been at sea in the US Merchant Marine for almost 8 years, ever since my 18th birthday. My parents died when I was 17, and I had very few prospects. I wasn't any great shakes at school, too interested in girls and weed and rock music. And the concept of college for an orphan with no trust fund, well, it wasn't going to happen. I tried to join the Navy. I had some fool ideas about going to sea and protecting the world. Damn silly now I look back on it. But they wouldn't take me. I'd gotten caught selling some weed when I was 17, right after Mum and Dad were killed in a car accident. You have a conviction, well, you have to apply for a moral waiver to join any of the armed force, and I was young and arrogant, and they said thanks by no thanks. Probably the right thing, I think about it now. I'd have made a shitty naval seaman. Too hard for me to not ask questions when given orders. Anyway, I wasn't taking no for an answer, so off I went and signed on to some ship, an oil tanker, the Pearly White. What a name. I went from contract to contract. Some ships have you on contract for a time period, 6 months or whatever, and when you are done, you can leave the ship at whatever port she happened to be in when the time is up. Some hire you for a specific voyage or set of trips. I wandered around from ship to ship. I had no one to go home to, no home to really speak of. I was brought up in Atlanta and had always wanted to go to sea. So there I was. It was a container transporter I was on, the Lady Grey. Bit of a rust bucket, but it got the job done. I was an able seaman by then. I was going to go for the bosun's ticket next time I got to port with an academy office at it. We were bound to Hong Kong out from Argentina. We weren't pushing it hard. We were pretty much fully loaded and had already lost 2 containers when we went through a squall early in the trip. Brett noticed both Bradley and Amelia looking a little shocked. Oh, it's no big deal. Happens more often than you might think. All the containers have to be heavily insured anyway, and the reality is that you pay extra to be lower in the ship. If you pay the least, you go on top, and it's known that can be risky. Just part of the glamour of shipping containers. Anyway, we were about 10 days out from Hong Kong. You tend to skirt the Pacific Rim if you can. rather than going direct across sea. If anything goes wrong, it's always better to be able to make landfall easily or have people come to you quickly. You only go direct across if time is of the essence. We got this call, a general keep an eye out alarm. I was doing bridge duty that day, and I remember it well. You don't get many of those. There are all sorts of rules you have to follow when you get one. Reduce speed. Radar on maximum, lookouts posted, coordination with other ships in the area, and so on. So, we slowed down. The captain wasn't happy about that because his bonus was directly related to us being on time, and now we wouldn't be. But there are maritime laws you have to abide by. We had no choice, and rightly so. Yet, we'd just missed a major storm that had come through a week or so ahead of us, thankfully. Those are never fun. Apparently, someone had been sailing the area and hadn't been heard from since the storm, and there was a lot of fuss about it. Someone important. As it turned out, it was my friend Marcus who saw her. We'd picked up something on radar, something small, that didn't respond to radio calls, so we'd made a small detour and then lowered the skiff the ship had aboard to go take a look. And sure enough, there it was. One very beaten-up, single-masted 40-footer, minus mast or sails, or pretty much anything. No propulsion, and it had obviously been through it. Everything not bolted down was washed away, and quite a lot that was bolted down too. The whole ship was pretty destroyed. It was just barely staying afloat, to be honest. There were some canvas scraps rigged up to catch water, so obviously the water containers on board were broached. The whole thing just smacked of desperation. We were yelling and firing the horn on the skiff as we approached, and there was no motion, so we were imagining the worst. Obviously someone had survived the storm, since there were those canvas water catchers. But it was possible that they hadn't made it past that. After all, you only survive a few days with no clean water. I was first aboard, since I was the one with what little medical training is required for container ships. I found your mother in the main cabin on a makeshift hammock. She was weak and not even completely conscious. The entire room was mostly flooded, stuff sloshing around our feet. We just grabbed her and bundled her up and carried her into the skiff. We put the boat on a tow and dropped a small pump into the cabin to pump out the water. We figured there might be something in the boat she might want later, so easier to just take it with us. She was moaning and groaning as I carried her. She was wearing a very torn set of pants and white top, which she'd torn the arms off to make a headscarf. She was obviously suffering from dehydration, and her tongue was enlarged and lips chapped. Thankfully, no sign of sun exposure. She'd kept below deck when the sun was up to avoid that, which was smart. It took us about 2 hours to get back to the container ship. Dragging the smashed boat with us wasn't doing us any favours, and the pump was working overtime throwing water over the side, as more seeped in from the dragging we were doing. It was clear when we tied up next to the container that it wasn't going to be long for this world. So as I carried our bedraggled victim up to what constitutes the medical bay, our chief engineer jumped down into the boat and started grabbing stuff from inside and passing it back, as fast as he could. The pump just wasn't keeping up, and it was clear it was going to sink pretty soon. We got a lot of stuff out of it, all the personal stuff we could find, plus some other waterlogged supplies. There was no point in trying to salvage any of the electronics, since we had all that kind of stuff aboard, plus it was all mostly destroyed anyway. We got some charts, some clothes, a couple of books, as many sealed containers as we could find, stuff like that. It took the boat about 3/4 of an hour to sink completely. We all watched it go down, slowly, solemnly staring. No mariner enjoys watching another ship go down. It's not only bad luck, it's the knowledge that someone, somewhere, is out a boat and probably a home. Davy Jones has a lot to answer for, at times. I'd got our passenger settled, put an IV into her to put some fluids in, with a sedative. She needed proper sleep. I'd checked her over, as much as was decent, and while there was a large bruise on her left hip and on the left side of her head, plus a deep cut down one forearm, from the just below the elbow to just above the wrist, she seemed to not be injured further. While we do have a medical bay on the ship, it's not really a hospital room. It has a small bed-like appliance in it, but that's more for things like basic dentistry or sewing up of wounds. It's not a bedroom in itself, although there was a spare berth next to that bay itself, which is where I ended up manhandling her into. The reality was that she was slightly delirious and mostly out of it. She was aware we'd got her, and that she wasn't on her little yacht anymore, and that she'd been rescued, but beyond that, she wasn't making much sense. She needed fluids, protein, and most of uninterrupted sleep. When I talked to the captain to give him an update on her condition, he grumbled a bit and then ordered the engines full ahead. I could tell he was intent of making up that time and, more importantly, making up his bonus. He'd been with the company for over 17 years, and he was only 4 more off full retirement, and I knew he was looking forward to it. He'd shown everyone pictures of the cabin he had picked out, on the Norwegian coast, for when it came. It was clear that his love affair with the sea had cooled considerably, and like a shitty marriage, he was tolerating being there until he could dump it unceremoniously and be where he wanted to be. He informed me that he'd radioed in the find, her condition, and been told that unless she had life-threatening injuries, which he now knew she didn't, that he was to go full ahead and try and make the port facilities at Hong Kong as soon as he could. She'd be put ashore there, hopefully fully restored. Brett stopped to take a drink. Thirsty work, all this talking. He wasn't used to it since Caroline had died. He mostly just listened these days. The radio, podcasts, the TV, whatever. Anything to make the house seemed lived in. One thing Caroline has been great about was always having things in motion. There was always something happening, something to talk about or discuss, and life felt very much lived. With her gone, it just didn't. He glanced at Amelia and Bradley, and they were intent on my every word, eyes shining. This was a story that had been hinted at but never really told, at least not to them. They just wanted to know. So, he continued, shifting his view to the placid sea outside the window. She slept for the next 12 hours. I moved my berth from my normal cabin to the one next to hers, at least temporarily. We actually had 6 passenger cabins on the ship. Sometimes the company would ask us to carry someone, or some company officers would be aboard, so we'd need somewhere to put them. So we had these 6 cabins, all with ensuite bathrooms. They were small and didn't have balconies or most of the amenities you get on a cruise ship, but they did have a small TV and VCR installed, shipboard phone and radio. The ship itself had a small tape library in the mess, something like 30 or 40 movies and TV shows, some of them English-based and some not. People took and brought as they came on board, so it was constantly changing. Remember, this is 25 years ago. No DVDs or Wi-Fi at that time. It was all strictly videotape or physical books. We had a lending library for that too, with as many current magazines as we could find when we docked, plus a healthy bunch of thrillers and spy novels and the like. So, I grabbed a book and settled in next door. The captain had made it plain that she was my problem to deal with, and although a fair number of the rest of the crew had some interest in her, popping in to ask her condition, most of them had work to do. It doesn't seem like there would be much to do on a ship that's taking containers to another port, but you'd be wrong. Ships like that need a lot of preventative maintenance, to keep them running and to be sure that the emergency equipment would work if required. There's a lot of work on a working container transporter, just like there is on an oil tanker or a cruise ship or any working vessel. Like I said, your mother slept for 12 hours straight, just dead to the world. I had left her door open a crack, so I could hear if she moved around or called out, and I managed to get 7 hours in myself, which I was surprised at. But I did her calling out, with that posh voice she has. She was calling, "Hello? Anyone there?" and sounding a lot more composed, so I hustled from my cabin and into hers. I can tell you right now, kids, I was smitten the moment I walked into that room. I'd had my fair share of instant infatuations in the past, but this was the real deal. I mean, you know what your mother looks like, but right then, she was in the flush of youth. Beautiful porcelain flawless skin, the deep auburn hair, the flashing eyes, those perfect eyebrows, the small mouth with the full lips. Just, wow. He glanced at the kids. and could see the expression on their faces, and then suddenly realised who he was talking to. This was their mother he was describing, probably in ways they'd never heard before, and in ways that were almost certainly making them uncomfortable. No child ever wants to hear of their parent what a hottie they were in their youth. For the first time, it dawned on him the story he was about to tell them. Did they really want to hear about their mother being unfaithful to the man they called father? Would it change their opinion of her? He had to ask. Hey, look, what I'm telling you. This can't be easy to hear, yeah? I mean, this may change how you view your mum, and I don't want that. You sure you want to hear this? He challenged them, shifting a little uncomfortably in his chair. Amelia snorted derisively and Bradley smirked. Yeah, the only thing this is going to do is improve our image of her. She's not been the most passionate of people growing up, Dad. The most animated we've seen her was when she finally came clean about our parentage. Hearing this makes her far more alive than she tends to be most of the time, honestly. So please, continue, Amelia said matter-of-factly. Does she still look the same? I try and not search her out on the internet. It would hurt too much, he admitted. Well, the hair has a fair bit of grey in it now. Mother is not one for putting on airs and graces unless she absolutely has to for some public event, so she doesn't dye it most of the time. And there's a few more crow's feet around the eyes and probably the lips. It's hard for me to really tell since she's always looked the same to me. But yes, I don't think she's really changed that much over the years, Amelia commented. Yes, no tattoos that we are aware of, laughed Bradley. Not unless they are really hidden. Bradley, that is Mummy you are talking about. Have some respect, chided Amelia hotly. Brett could see Bradley was more than a chip off my old block, whereas Amelia was definitely a carbon copy of her mother. Ramrod posture, clipped elocution, and absolutely zero pretenser. When you are related to the Queen of England by birth, no matter how remotely, what's the point in being a poser? Bradley smirked back, and yet again he knew he'd seen that expression before. Where though? Was it in the mirror? He smiled. He had all sorts of conflicting feelings, being kept apart from these children for so many years, not even really believing they were mine. He'd missed out on so much of their life, and that was very upsetting. But they were here now, and they wanted to know him. And that's something. That's very definitely something. He looked from Bradley to Amelia's gaze, now directed back at Brett, eyes shining, with that pleased and expectant expression on her face, so similar to her mother's. That same wide smile, inviting expression, where she made it feel like you were the only person in the world and she was paying you all of the attention she could. Glancing back at Bradley, he could see him sitting back, trying to effect a cooler and more casual pose. But he could see the posture. He could see the eagerness in his body language. This was as important to him as it was to his sister. He just didn't want it to appear that way. He gave that one chuckle you do when you make a realization, one that makes you smile internally. And looking back at Amelia's face, he was transported back 25 years, back to that dirty container ship, the Lady Grey, to the point where Fiona had just reawakened. Hello. I'm assuming I was rescued? The lady on the bed asked expectantly. She was holding her bedclothes up to cover whatever modesty she felt she had to, after Brett had knocked and entered the little cabin. Yes, indeed, he answered, coming over the bed. I'm Brett. I'm the, as much of a medic as we have on this bag of bolts. Brett Bell, able seaman. American, then? Is this an American ship? She said, more as a statement than a question. She had a very clipped British accent. I didn't know much about accents, but it seemed quite upper class to me. Actually registered in Honduras, at least the company is. Why, I don't know. We are part of a container fleet out from Buenos Aires, bound for Hong Kong, due in about 10 days or so, weather permitting. For some reason, Brett found himself adopting her method of speech. Direct, to the point, with clarity, no unnecessary words. Well, you came along just in the nick of time, didn't you? Quiet manna from heaven and no question." She smiled uncertainly. "Did Peppermint Joy make it?" she asked suddenly. "Your ship?" "I'm afraid not. It was filling with water. The towing we put it under to bring you to the main ship just loaded it up. We got all we could out of it, but it went down about 2 hours after we got you on board. I'm sorry." Brett added the last because he knew the lone sailors got very attached to their ships. "Oh well, I guess it was going to at some point." She had quite a battering in that last storm, much more than she was rated for. There were winds of over 100 miles per hour, at least before my little weather station gave out. The hurricane? Was it a hurricane? Or a typhoon? Or a cyclone? I think it was a cyclone because we were in the South Pacific. Is that right? You'd know, wouldn't you? This was all delivered very fast, with her running her hand through her chestnut hair in the most attractive and unself-conscious way. It was incredibly attractive to Brett. Brett was to discover this was a prime Fiona trait, delivering information very fast and veering off into a sidebar equally fast. "Does it really matter?" Brett asked, mainly because he wasn't that sure either. They were in the South Pacific. Barely, but most of the crew referred to them as typhoons. "No, I suppose not," answered the lady, not break her train of thought. "Yes, so big storm, typhoon, whatever. It came up behind me. I knew about it, of course, but I was trying to outrun it, use its own force against it. When it became clear that wasn't going to work, I reversed direction. The storm, did it have a name, by the way? I never got one. Was heading northwest, so I started heading southwest, trying to get out of its path. That didn't work out so well either. I got caught on the middle edge, as best I can judge. There was nothing for it but to batten down the hatches, as they say, and try and ride it out. I tied myself to the tiller and held on for dear life. It was quite the battering, I have to say. I've not experienced anything like it." She stopped for a second and looked at the bandage I'd put on her arm. "I got this as the mast went over. When it did, it took the small radar dish with it and the radio mast, and that's when this happened. Sliced my arm open. I did the best I could with some old clothes to bind it up. About the only thing that didn't get crushed or lost was the medical kit." Brett had noticed she'd at least tried to deal with the gash. It was at least clean and wrapped when they'd found her, something that had no doubt saved her life. Infection would have been almost impossible for her to deal with in the deep ocean. It took almost 7 hours before the waves stopped being so high. I did my best to steer through them, but I knew once it calmed, I was in trouble. The boat did spring some leaks and salt water got into the batteries, and once that happened, solar panels or not, my radio was kaput. I did trigger the emergency beacon, but I don't think it was working either. Hard to really tell, to be honest. I tried the flares too, that first night, once I'd done inventory, which didn't take long, let me tell you. And nothing was doing from that. So, I took stock, realised my freshwater supplies were mostly gone, and had to deal. As you do, you know. She delivered this so matter-of-factly that it was impressive. Brett was astonished at her resilience. I did all the things I'd seen on television, the survival stuff. You know, fashioned a water catch from what was left of my canvas sails, built myself a little fishing pole. All the do-it-yourself stuff. Fiona was almost excited about retelling the things she'd done, justifiably proud of herself for surviving and not panicking. I did have some food left that wasn't spoiled, and some cans of pop and the like, a few bottles of water, that sort of thing. Enough that I could survive a while, but I had nothing else to do, so I tried to learn how to fish. Can I tell you a secret? It's incredibly boring. I mean, I don't know how those fellas do it every weekend. Their wives must be something terrible to drive those men to sit on a riverbank all day and just stare at water. It almost drove me batty, I have to say. Fiona was like a schoolgirl, confiding about which boy she had a crush on. Brett tried to get a word in edgeways. I'd like to... And I'll never be able to look a plate of cod and chips in the face again either, she added to herself, interrupting him. Anyway, I ran out of water about 3 or 4 days ago, and I have to say, I started to feel a little less than tip-top, if you know what I mean. With no way to contact anybody or any method of propelling the boat, well, I just tried to keep busy and not let myself get too down. And then you must have showed up, like my knight in shining armour. And here I am, she said, brightly, as though this was an everyday occurrence. How she managed to speak the word armour with an audible U, Brett wasn't quite sure, but she managed it. She was so indescribably British, and radiant, and full of life, and Brett was utterly captivated. Okay. Well, you appear to have come through your ordeal relatively unscathed, as far as I can tell. The arm gash I did put some stitches in, since it needed them. Sorry about the needlework. You were dehydrated and a little malnourished and mostly needed sleep. Well done staying out of the sun, by the way. Not having to deal with sunburn is really good, he said, getting up off the chair he was sitting on while Fiona was telling her story. May I? He asked, holding out his hand for hers. Shyly, she gave him her hand and he grabbed it, looking at his watch to check her pulse. 80 beats per minute, which was fine. I'd like to... And sitting on the side of the bed, he grabbed her head and looked into her eyes, moving her head around and watching her eyes focus on him. Doesn't look like there's any concussion, so whatever generated that bump didn't hit your head, I don't think. No, she said, still looking him in the eyes, unblinking. That was me getting thrown against the tiller. Painfully, but as Daddy says, pain is weakness leaving the body. Which is so incredibly stupid. I mean, someone who's been shot must be so fit, according to that logic, but whatever. Daddy says a lot of things like that. Still love him, though. You have to, don't you find? Follow my finger, he said, holding up his forefinger and moving it back and forth. She compiled and he nodded. Yeah, you are fine. Just needed some liquids and some stress-free rest. Speaking of that. He grabbed her hand and quickly yanked out the feed. Ouch! She exclaimed, rubbing the back of her hand. Where did you go to school, Doctor? Auschwitz? Sorry. Getting it over quickly is the best way, he replied, rolling up the tubes and bag. I'll bet you say that to all the girls, she said, smiling lopsidedly. Look, you need to get something on. We put the clothes we could salvage in the closet over there. They are still in the suitcases and stuff we could get out, so you'll have to sort through them, I'm afraid. Fiona looked interested, then suddenly something seemed to occur to her, and she lifted the bedclothes and looked down at herself. Ah! I appear to be... somewhat unclothed, she said, somewhat unsure. Yes, sorry about that. I promise I held my hands over my eyes, Brett said, fighting back a smirk. I had to examine you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to ask your permission, but you were somewhat out of it. She nodded back. Yes, I suppose so. Next time, though, please, ask first. You never know what I'll answer. She had a glow in her face and twinkle in her eyes, and Brett was hit with a sudden surge of desire. She was pretty much his perfect woman, at least in appearance. In personality, well, the jury was still out on that. No such thing as love at first sight. His parents had drilled that into him, for sure. Something else occurred to her. Hey, do you have a shower on this boat? A proper one? Not one of those drip things like in my yacht? Brett nodded, glad to have something else to think about. Sure. Back behind the door, each cabin has its own shower room. It's not hotel quality, but it's pretty good. If anything, the glow in Fiona's face intensified. Oh, I've been so waiting for one of those. The shower on the boat was... basic. And I could rarely use it when at sea because fresh water, you see. Once the storm hit, well, I couldn't use it at all. And I soon learned that soap doesn't work in seawater. I should have thought to bring some seawater soap with me, but it just didn't occur to me. So, quite ripe by now, you see. She coquettishly raised armpit and sniffed humorously, holding the sheet against herself. Quite the pong, I'm afraid. I'm surprised you didn't find me from just following the stink. Brett smiled again. Her good humour was infectious. Speaking of that, he had to ask. I don't mean to speak out of turn, but you seem… well, you've stared death in the face. You must have thought… He didn't finish the thought, suddenly thinking it wasn't a smart thing to be saying. Fiona's face faltered a little, then recovered as though she was gathering strength. Well, British, you see. Stiff upper lip and all that. Honestly, though, yes, there were times when I thought I was a goner for sure. But, well, you can't just give up, can you? I did my best to get fresh water, eat whatever I could find, ration the supplies, just survive, really. At some point, someone was going to find me. I just had to stay alive till they did. I mean, what's the alternative? Jump overboard and drown myself? Cut myself and hope there were sharks? None of that sounds very palatable, does it? What would you have done? Well, yes, Brett said, stoking his chin. When you put it like that, yes, I suppose you are right. Never really thought about it, to be honest. Not something you want to… No, said Fiona, staring off into the distance. Be glad you don't have to, she added quietly, after a moment's reflection. So, asked Brett a few seconds later, more to fill the silence than anything. Is there someone we need to notify? Someone you want to talk to? Oh, exclaimed Fiona. Yes, of course. Should have thought of that immediately. Sorry, the prospect of a hot shower made everything else slip my mind. Yes, well, Daddy, of course. He'll be beside himself by now, I'm sure. And Eric, I suppose. Eric? Asked Brett with a sinking feeling. Yes, husband. Well, in name, anyway. Daddy loves him more than I do, I think. No brothers, you see. Essential he needed someone to pass on the title and family lands to. Daddy is very old-fashioned that way. Apparently Eric is an incredibly handy bloke to have around. And Eric, it has to be said, apparently feels the same way about Daddy. When they get talking, the brandy and cigars come out, and I might as well not be in the room. It's terribly boring, frankly. Eric certainly wasn't my first choice, but Daddy had his heart set on Eric as the best of the bunch. I'm sorry, said Brett, a little confused. Best of the… bunch? Oh yes, suitors. Once you've come out, you get a lot of them, all sniffing around for the title and a girl's hand in marriage. Still quite old-fashioned. I'm sorry, said Brett again. I'm quite lost here. Coming out? To be honest, I still don't even really know who you are. Her eyes narrowed. You mean you've been chatting me up and no clue who I am? Really? What a world. She rolled her eyes dramatically. I'm Fiona. Fiona Birmingham Hart. That's hyphenated. I'm the Lady Fiona, in fact. My father is the Duke of Ipswich, back home in Blighty. Eric, my husband, is due to inherit the title when Dad shuffles off, specially selected for the privilege. I get to sit around and look pretty and pump out children, which is the use that women of station back home tend to get put to. Well, I may have been married off to some fella I didn't choose, but I'm damned if I'm just sitting around having luncheons with other vacuous ladies in waiting. Stuff that for a lark. I want to get out into the world. I want to do something. Hence the sailing. Oh, I see. Well, do I have to call you something? Is there a title we should use? She chuckled. Well, as long as it's not oi you, I think Fiona will do just fine. Let's not go down the fi-fi route though, please. I get enough of that from Mother, and frankly I hate it. So twee. She made motions of sticking her fingers down her throat, and once again Brett was mesmerised by her vitality. Right. Well, so… I'll go talk to the captain and see if he can set up a ship to shore call. It's a little complicated to set those up, but we can at least get a message to your husband. Eric. Is he also Birmingham… He'd lost the name somehow. Hart. Yes. But I would bother. I doubt he's even noticed I've gone, to be honest. He is inattentive at the best of times. Out of sight, out of mind for him. He's far more worried about breeding his prize bull than he is in his wife. No, try Daddy. Duke of Ipswich. Just get a message to the UK government and they'll find him. If I know Daddy, he's probably already doing his damnedest to get a call placed here. Fine. Okay. Yes, I'll do that, stammered Brett disappointedly. Let me... You know what I really could use, said Fiona as Brett rose to leave. A cup of tea. God, what I wouldn't give for a decent one. It's been almost 2 weeks since I had one. I suppose all that went down too, she said sadly. Let me go look, answered Brett on firmer ground now, since he was pretty sure some of that had been pulled out. You shower and I'll be back with whatever we got out of the boat, okay? Sound like a plan, she agreed, laughing. Go, before you see something you shouldn't. Brett left the cabin, carefully closing the door behind him, and went in search of the cabin where they'd stashed what they'd gathered from her craft. 45 minutes later, he was back at her cabin door, cup cradled in his hand, large plastic pelican box on wheels in another. It was one of the new travel cups that were all the rage around the world, with the wide base to keep it stable. He knocked on the door, listening carefully for a response. Hello inside, can I come in? He dimly heard a, wait a second, and then a minute later, the door opened slightly. He saw a vision of alabaster skin, wrapped in a large towel. One thing the line of ships did not skimp on was towels, with another wrapped around her head through the crack. It's you, isn't it, Brett? She inquired through the crack in the door. Yes. Got something for you, he answered, brandishing the cup. Is that? She asked, hand on her mouth. Brett just grinned back. Oh my God, marry me, she exclaimed, throwing back the door. Here you go, he said, handing her the cup. We found some tea bags in a plastic container, and they were dry, so it was one of the things grabbed. This, he said, gesturing at the large pelican case, has some of your clothes in it. This is what we got out of the drawers, and that wouldn't fit in the closet in your cabin. There's more back in the other cabin, along with everything else we salvaged. You can go through them later. I thought you might want some new clothes now. Oh God, yes, I take it back. Let's just spend a week having a long dirty weekend. Best offer right now. Fiona was clearly delighted, and after Brett dragged the box in and dumped it on her bunk, immediately opened it and started rummaging around. Oh, you got my delicates. Well, good, I suppose. Let's see. She pulled out a t-shirt, a bra, some panties and some sweatpants, and eyed them critically. Well, they could use a wash, but not too pongy. They'll do for now. You don't happen to have a washing machine on board, do you? She said, not paying attention and not expecting an answer. Actually, we do. Next deck down. You are supposed to buy your own detergent, but you can use mine. You do? She squealed. Wow, I really did luck out. Fantastic. I'm going to drink my tea, put some clothes on, and then we can go and do some laundry. Wonderful news. And then she looked pointedly at Brett. He just stared back, even more mesmerised. Her lithe body was apparent under the towel, even with the gash on her arm and the bruise on her head. She was very attractive, never more so when vulnerable as she was at that moment. Eventually she coughed politely, and he suddenly realised that not only was he staring, slack-jawed, but she wanted to get dressed and he was preventing that. Oh? Right. Yes. Of course. Sorry, stammered Brett. He seemed to be doing that a lot around her. I'll be going. Yes. I'm in the next cabin. When you're done, just pound on the door. I'll take you to the laundry. The captain is arranging a call for you, probably be tomorrow, but at least he's gotten word that you've been found to the appropriate people. Oh, good. That's very good to know. Thank you. I'll find you in a little bit, yes? She said, literally fanning him out of the cabin. Embarrassed that he couldn't apparently take a hint, Brett turned and stumbled out of the cabin, heading immediately to his own. He made a call to the bridge to inform the captain that their guest was up and around, and that she'd be requesting a call to her nearest and dearest at his convenience, to which he got a grunted reply. He also explained that she'd be going through what they'd salvaged, doing some laundry and generally getting acquainted with her new home, for the next few days at least. He did ask that the captain prepare the crew for the fact that they had a new guest, and that she was actually minor British royalty, so best be on their best behaviour. The elicited another grunt. But Brett was sure that the captain wouldn't want any bad reports percolating to the board of the company that owned the ship, so he'd probably at least put the word out that she was out of bounds. The captain then indicated that he'd been given light duties, less than half his regular duty shifts, and their passenger was now his responsibility. He was there to keep her happy and have her the picture of health when they disembarked. 20 minutes later, there was a tap on the door, and he opened it to find a much refreshed and rejuvenated Fiona, grinning at him stupidly. Okay then, what do you call it? The 25-cent tour? My thinking was, let's go look at what you guys salvaged, then we can stop by the launderette and then we could get something to eat. I'm starving, almost literally. She laughed the last bit, a little self-consciously. Brett learned pretty fast that Fiona was all about making short-term plans, then following them to the letter with almost military precision. He found himself nodding along. Yeah, that works. I think Cookie should have some things to eat. He normally has pastries and stuff like that, although... He glanced at his watch. It's almost noon. Lunch is probably almost ready. It certainly will be once we are done with those chores. He nodded again, and then looked inquiringly at Fiona, as she cocked her head at him and smiled a lopsided smile. What? You are cute when you are confronted by a demanding woman, she said, pursing her lips at him. Has anyone ever told you that, Sir Knight? Brett felt very self-conscious after that statement, and just didn't know how to respond. They stood, staring at each other for a moment, before he chickened out and coughed. Right, shall we? Her smile got wider, and then she reached out and grabbed his arm, hooking hers through his. Lead on, good sir. They went to the storage room where what had been grabbed was stored, and Fiona spent the next half hour going through it, lamenting what had not been saved 1 minute, and then whooping with delight when, rummaging through, she found something she'd thought lost forever. 30 minutes later, she had an armful of clothes, and her unmentionables, as she put it, in a plastic bag, and was ready for the laundry room. The laundry was 1 floor down, and Fiona had quite a time getting down the narrow stairs-cum-ladder between floors. Space on a ship was at a premium, and stairs were an afterthought. A container ship was different from most large ships, in that all the storage and people-based facilities were located in one section, at the back, in a large upright building on the superstructure, named the sail, even though there was no actual sail to be found anywhere on the ship. Eventually they made it, with much backtracking to pick up items dropped, and somehow, by the time they go there, Brett seemed to be carrying more than Fiona was. Fiona oohed and ahed over the laundry facilities, declaring that she'd never seen better, which was obviously a very large lie since they were basic at best, and that it was a lot better than washing her things in a sink and tying them on the mast to dry. The concept of all clean clothes was quite going to her head after so long without. Once they were on a wash cycle, using all 3 machines in the room, Fiona announced it was time for the tour and then lunch. Brett took her on a cheap tour, walking her around the sail, showing her the mess, the library, the bridge, where she elicited more than a few longing glances from the crew stationed there at the time. He introduced her to the captain, and they had a quick chat about her making a ship-to-shore call, which the captain agreed to arrange, after he explained their destination and route. He even took her down to the engine room, where she met Jock, their chief engineer, a dour Scotsman who did not take to her at all. Brett had noticed that she was charming to everyone she met, and after being introduced to them by name, thanking them all for her life. She was sincere and put her hand on them, while looking them in the eye and thanking them for being there for her. The only person it didn't work on was Jock, but then, as Brett explained, he was a miserable bastard and didn't like anyone anyway. But otherwise, Brett was in awe of her people-handling abilities, never more than when they encountered Pierre in the mess. Pierre was the cook, and a more archetypal French short-order cook it would be hard to find. Lanky, unwashed hair, perpetual cigarette on his lips, insolence when his food was questioned, French accented sarcasm, and a deeply held personal belief that no woman could ever resist him. When he saw her coming, he hurriedly licked his hand and slicked back his hair and put on the phoniest smile. "Well, mon amour, to our humble—" "Can it, Pierre?" interrupted Brett, not willing to let Pierre go through his whole spiel. "What's for lunch?" "For you. I have some dog turds I cooked up. For the lady. The very best meatloaf, made with love and flavoured to the taste of the best French restaurant. I heard there was someone on board who might appreciate it rather than these tasteless barbarians. So for you, gorgeous." "Does that ever work?" asked Fiona innocently, breaking into the long speech. "I mean, as patter goes, it's pretty basic. The accent is good, and will forgive a lot, but honestly, we are on a shipping container ship in the Pacific Ocean. I've just been rescued from a sinking ship, from almost certain death, and right now I feel like death warmed over. What exactly are you expecting here?" Pierre was disconcerted. Women didn't normally directly question him on his motives in this way, and he was at a loss to know the best way to recover. Brett grinned widely, enjoying the experience of Pierre being accosted in this way. I just wanted you to experience some class amount all these Philistines," he rallied uncertainly. Fiona suddenly smiled wide. "Oh, don't take me seriously, Pierre. I'm just having you on. Thank you for the greeting and for cooking this for me. It's most appreciated. I'm sure we will be great friends," she sighed, emphasizing the friend's word so he would understand that she was not interested in him any other way. "Still, let's see what we have here." She took a little of everything on offer, smiling at Pierre, who had a very disconcerted look on his face. Then, winking at Brett, she went to sat down and eat. Brett got his plate full, delivered with a lot less deference than Fiona, and he went to sit with her. With barely an "I'm starving" statement, Fiona fell upon her food. 4 mouthfuls in, she stopped. "Oh no," she murmured. 2 more mouthfuls. "Oh, this won't do at all. No, no, no." And she got up and went over to where Pierre was now serving 2 other crewmen who'd come in, both of which were paying her considerable visual attention. "Pierre, now we must talk. This won't do. No, we can do better than this. I'm sure if we got our heads together, we could better than what's on offer today. Were you rushed?" Fiona's voice was clipped but firm. Even to Brett, she was clearly playing the aristocrat abroad rule to the hilt. Pierre just stared at her, and eventually said, "Well, it's not exactly the Waldorf kitchen back here." The French reputation for sarcasm intact. "I'm sure. However, there is more that can be done here. Do you have some barbecue sauce anywhere? Perhaps some Worcestershire? What about ground pepper?" There was more staring, then suddenly Pierre got animated, went back in the galley. There were sounds of rummaging around, and he appeared again, with bottle of HP sauce and a pepper shaker. "Right, excellent now. What we are going to do," started Fiona. "Hold on. Wait a minute," protested Pierre, suddenly growing a backbone. "This is my kitchen. What do you think you are doing?" Hot woman or not, Pierre was not about to take cooking lessons from the British. Fiona sighed, and then went straight to the point. "What's it going to take, Pierre? A look at my tits?" Brett almost snorted his Diet Coke out of his nose hearing that. It was an incredible juxtaposition. The words versus the plummy British accent that delivered them. Pierre's mouth dropped open, and the dangling unlit cigarette dropped into the mashed potatoes, unseen by anyone. "Fine then," said Fiona, and she suddenly just hoisted her top, just for a second, to give Pierre a quick glimpse. No one else was looking at the right angle, and it was all so fast that everyone else in the room was just stunned. "Now, you've got yours, my turn. Let's do this meatloaf up a bit, and I can give you some tips on the mash too, later. Have you any onion soup mix, for example?" She reached out and took the HP sauce bottle from a totally stunned Pierre, whose mouth was still open, with no words coming out, and then emptied it over the meatloaf on the tray, then took the pepper and dumped a bunch of that on it too. "Right, that should do it," she said, dusting her hands against each other. "You fellas, give that a try. See what you think?" she said to the other two, equally stunned crewmen, gesturing at the meatloaf. And then she turned and sat down with Brett, smiling broadly. Brett suddenly paused in his recounting, suddenly realizing who he was relating this story to. They were her children, after all. He stole a look at Amelia, who was sitting, open-mouthed, reminiscent of how Pierre looked. Glancing at Bradley, he noticed that Bradley was fighting to keep a straight face. Looking back at Amelia, confused, Brett noticed she was shaking too. Suddenly, Amelia let out a massive belly laugh, and Bradley joined her a split second later. The two of them fell about, laughing in the kind of way people do when they simply can't control it. Brett just sat there, looking at them, wondering what was going on in those heads of theirs. Eventually, Amelia, wiping her eyes, said, "Sorry, Dad. Yeah, I know. A bit risque for dear old Mum, right? But when you know Mum, that sounds exactly like something she'd do, right, brother?" "Oh God, yes," replied Bradley, wiping his own face. "That's Mum, down to a T. Remember the calendar?" Brett sat there, feeling quite left out, blank expression on his face. "So did you ever hear about that film with the women of the Women's Institute, who made a nude calendar? It had Helen Mirren and Julie Waters in it. No? It was a big thing in the UK, based on a true story, about a bunch of old biddies who make a nudie calendar in order to make money for a local hospital. Well, when Mum saw that, she couldn't be stopped. She had all the local women's organisations posing nude at the estate within the week. Dad just shook his head and left for the stables, not wanting to have anything to do with it. Mum did it all, and even posed. She put out 4 calendars a year for the next 7 years, and earned the local charities almost £500,000 doing it. That's who Mum is, so your story, well, it's absolutely on par for her. Colour us entirely unsurprised. Brett sat considering the story. He could well believe it. And now he was wondering how to ask if the kids still had any of those calendars. "Sorry," said Bradley. "We didn't mean to interrupt. Please, carry on." Clearing his throat, Brett continued. Later that day, feeling much refreshed, Bradley suggested a walk around the ship. "You mean we can go all the way around? Those big boxes aren't in the way?" asked Fiona. "Well, they are fairly intrusive, but no, there's a walkway all the way around," explained Brett. "It gets a bit narrow in the bows, but it is open. Some of the crew use scooters to get around, in fact." "How long is it?" asked a curious Fiona. "Almost exactly 1/5 of a mile all the way around," replied Brett. "So 5 times around is a mile." Fiona was sounding more excited by the second. "I could run around?" "Well, yes, I do that regularly. Much nicer than the treadmill in the gym." "Wait, stop. You have a gym on this boat," exclaimed Fiona excitedly, stopping in her tracks and thumping a foot down. "Well, I wouldn't say it's much. A multi-gym machine, some free weights, a treadmill. Not much." "Take me there right now," said Fiona emphatically, grabbing Brett by the shirt. "I had to make do with this stupid Bowflex thing on the boat. Way too cramped and not very good, but the most I could take on the ship. I had it mounted on the hull at the front. It was not good, but best I could get. A real gym. Oh yes, I can run. Wait, can we go back to the storage room first?" Brett nodded and guided her back to the storage area. Fiona dug into the boxes and suddenly shouted with glee, "Aha!" She held up a small Sony Walkman, complete with small headphones. More rummaging and a second aha. Next, she held up a small plastic box with a bunch of tapes in them. "Now, just got to see," she muttered, diving into another box. "There we go," she yelled triumphantly a few seconds later, holding up 2 tennis shoes. "All set. Now we can run together." Brett was a little dubious. You've just had a life or death experience, Fiona, and your body is recovering. I don't think the gym is necessarily... Yes, thank you, Doctor, she said, ignoring him and doing more rummaging in her boxes. I understand. I'll take it easy, she continued, in a voice that indicated she would do no such thing at all. Right, she said a few minutes later, her arms full of what looked like workout clothes. And was that a sports bra? Now show me this gym, she demanded. They went. She oh'd and ahed for a few minutes, then put on her shoes and tried the treadmill for a few minutes, tired quickly, then tried a few free weights. Brett just sat and watched, understanding that any warnings he would give would be ignored anyway, since that was the kind of girl Fiona was. She'd learn pretty quickly anyway. 5 minutes into a small weights regime, Fiona suddenly slowed and gingerly put the weights down. Well, that hurts. Guess the working out on the boat, such as it was, wasn't hitting the spot, she said, breathing heavily. Or it could be the lack of decent nutrition and distinct lack of water over the past few days too, you never know, replied Brett sarcastically. But what would I know, not being a doctor and all? He got a mock glare from Fiona, and then she said in a much smaller voice, Perhaps I should take it a bit easier. Sorry, Brett. Just so excited to be among all the things I've missed for the past couple of months. Being alone and on a small boat like that, well... There was a lot unspoken in that last statement, and Brett decided that he'd do his best to act as confessor and psychiatrist to the best of his ability. Fiona was putting on a front to cover her own terror at what she'd been through. That much was obvious. But he wasn't trained in this, and as such, the best thing he could be to her was a friend and sounding board, so she might get over her own demons. Let's get you back to your room. Pick up something to eat on the way, and then you should take a nap. Your body needs sustenance and rest. Fiona looked at him curiously. Did you just say sustenance and use it in a sentence? She demanded, after 20 seconds of silent staring. Brett just nodded, suddenly embarrassed. You Americans, always a surprise, she muttered, moving to the door. They picked up a small sandwich snack and Fiona was yawning by the time they got back to her room. Actually, yawn. Now that you mention it, I am feeling quite tired. Brett nodded. All classic delayed shock symptoms. She needed sleep more than anything. As they reached her door, she stopped abruptly, turned and reaching up on her toes, gave Brett a kiss on his cheek. You really are a dear, aren't you? Looking after me so nicely. Don't you have anything else you should be doing? A shift or be on duty or something? Brett nodded. I have a shift later tonight when you'll be asleep. It's pretty easy. Basic bridge duty. Nothing exciting. Oh, you aren't at my beck and call then? Oh, I am. As much as I can be. When I'm not on duty, I'm all yours. Brett regretted the phrasing of the last sentence the moment it left his lips. Fiona, it appeared, picked up on it. Well then, that's enough to give a girl ideas, sailor, she said, giving him a very saucy wink. Wake me in a bit. Certainly, anything else you need? I wish I had my tapes. And my player, she said, after a moment of considering. Probably at the bottom of the deep blue sea right now, though, she continued sadly. Oh well, no point in crying over spilt milk. Time to make do. See you in a bit. And she yawned again, and it struck Brett suddenly that this woman could make even yawning attractive, and as such, she was probably highly dangerous goods to be around. Brett stopped narrating for a moment and looked into uncomprehending faces. Tapes, he said. Cassette tapes. Small Walkman player, you know. We used to record albums onto them, or make mixtapes of different tracks. This is all happening at a time when CDs had just come into being, and your mother hadn't caught up with the new hotness at that time. Amelia nodded knowledgeably once she understood. Those are the things you used to use a pencil to roll the little rollers around, right? When the tape came out of the cassette thingy. Yeah, you got it. At the time, we used to have boom boxes. Big old box with a tape player and a radio and big old speakers at either end. Most people had one. They took those huge batteries. Well, thank God we use iPods now, eh, bro? Said Amelia, grinning at her brother. Bloody dark ages. Don't let your mother hear that, admonished Brett. I don't know her that well, but I know she loved her music and her mixtapes. Yeah, don't we know it, sighed Bradley. She's still making mixtapes on CDs and now on her iTunes account. Still totally stuck in the 1980s too. I mean, who the hell is Kagagoo anyway? He asked to no one in particular disgustedly. I don't know. Brett had a little chuckle and then went back to his story. Fiona slept, and while she did, Brett went by the storage compartment and did a more thorough inspection of what had been salvaged. He found a few things that he thought would make Fiona happy and gathered them up, then went to the laundry room to collect her now cleaned and dried things. Face red with embarrassment, he grabbed a basket and collected them all together and took them back to his room, praying he wouldn't run into any of the crew. Explaining why he had a basket that contained women's underwear was not something he'd relish. Once he'd dropped that off, he sat in the medical bay, doing a long overdue stock check. Glancing at the time, he'd noticed 3 hours had passed, so he stood, stretched, and headed off to the galley to get some hot food. He found Pierre doing his usual I'm better than everyone else act, and grabbed a couple of plates of his chicken pot pie, a couple of Cokes, and wandered back down to Fiona's room. He knocked on the door, balancing the plates with the other hand, and had to wait for a moment before a yawning, dishevelled Fiona opened the door. "Oh, hot food! What do we have here?" she exclaimed, spying the plates. "Chicken pot pie. Not very good, I'm afraid, but it's fresh and it's hot and it'll do you good," he replied, handing her a plate. "What, no Diet Coke?" she asked, holding up the Coke can. "I'm sure I could," replied Brett, rising. No, I'm just ragging you. Don't get up, I'm just burning your wick," exclaimed Fiona hastily. "Trust me, I could probably do with the sugar," she added, popping open the can and taking a long draught. Then she looked over at Brett and started singing, hilariously off-key, "I'd like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony," before cracking herself up and giggling like a little girl. "Oh, come on, that was funny," she admonished a stone-faced Brett, who was doing his best not to laugh. Brett allowed a small smile to play across his face, and then, very soberly and with studied nonchalance, he picked up a small carrot from his plate and threw it at Fiona. She sat there, mouth open, the carrot sticking to her nose. "Did you just—" she said in disbelief. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," he retorted, now focusing on his plate, using the fork he'd brought with him to scoop up some pie. "Yum. You should eat yours while it's hot." Fiona kept staring at him, and then, with as much grace as she could, she took the carrot off her nose and ate it. "Oh, it's so on. I would throw this entire plate at you, but I'm hungry, and I need what's the word? Oh yes, I need the sustenance. But don't you think for 1 second this is over, Buster? Not by a long chalk. You'll get yours. Believe it. I spent 4 years at Benedon Girls' School, mate, and we know how to get even." And with that, she scooped up some of her own pie. They ate in silence for the next 10 minutes, until both had cleaned their plate. Brett could see Fiona staring at her plate, gears moving. He reached in and took the plate, murmuring, "Pierre would kill us both if this got broken, so I'll just take that." Brett was enjoying having Fiona off balance for a change. He could tell she wanted to one-up him, and honestly, he'd probably let her. It was good for her soul, some simple pranking. "Let me take these back, and then I have something for you," he said, standing to take the plates back to the galley. "A present? For me? Oh, sir, you do know how to flatter a girl. More carrots, I presume?" Her sarcasm was thick and well laid. He snorted and wandered out, taking the plates with him. When he got back, he stopped by his cabin and grabbed the basket before returning to her room. "Knock, knock," he said, opening the door, realizing as he did so, that was probably inappropriate. She was lying on the bed, head in one hand, looking, well, frankly, radiant. He mentally kicked himself again. He had no business thinking that, even if she did look it, bruises and all. "Here," he said, handing her the basket, while keeping the other hand behind his back. "Oh, laundry. My, Mr. Bell, you certainly know how to sweep a girl off her feet with gifts like that. Good thing I'm already flat on my back, eh? Or I might have sprained it swooning." Yeah, replied Brett, grinning at her. That's not the gift, this is. Tada. Anby brought his other hand from his back, holding her Walkman, headphones and a small box that contained a bunch of cassette tapes. "Oh my God, my Walkman!" exclaimed Fiona, suddenly very excited. She jumped up, throwing the basket aside. "Oh, I could kiss you, in fact." She then threw her arms around him and gave him a big smack on the lips, on tiptoe to reach him. It was obviously intended just as a quick peck, but somehow they stayed in that pose for at least 10 seconds, 4 or 5 seconds longer than was really comfortable. Then she jerked back, looking him dead in the eye, neither one of them knowing what to do next, and then she grabbed him again and gave him a longer kiss, harder, and of the kind normally reserved for long-time boyfriends or husbands. It was possibly the best, most unexpected kiss of Brett's life, something he'd been thinking about for the past day at least and never expected to happen. He was aware this was someone else's wife, but for that second, it just didn't matter. When they broke the kiss, Fiona stepped back, flushed and breathing heavily. Sorry, just so glad to get my tapes back," she muttered, not meeting his eyes. "Yes," coughed Brett, not really knowing what to say himself. "We found them in this plastic box, looks like it was waterproof, so we grabbed them. When you mentioned your tapes, I did think we might have got them. So I went..." And that was as far as he got, when Fiona just pulled him back into kiss, this time pulling his head down to meet hers. This kiss went on longer and involved tongue, and it was the kind of kiss that curled your toes. Brett had never had one like it, and it was something he vowed to get more often, never having realised it could be like this. With his hands full, all he could do was put his arms around her and draw her in even more than she already was. Eventually they had to come up for air, and again they broke apart, both breathing heavily, staring at each other, wondering what had just happened. He started to stammer, aware he needed to break the awkward silence. "No, Look, I'm sorry. Must be something to do with the concussion," Fiona said hurriedly, and Brett wisely didn't point out that she didn't have a concussion. "It's fine. Frankly, that's the best kiss I've had all year." "Any year," he replied, trying to be nonchalant, to let her off the hook. There was a considered silence. Fiona looked at him with a small, bemused smile on her face. Brett took the opportunity to break the eye contact and put down her Walkman and tapes on the table next to them. "Oh yeah?" she asked breathlessly. Brett was suddenly aware that this wasn't over as he turned back to her. She was, for God's sake, interested. She wasn't regretting it. She was now actively considering teasing him. This was not good. It was very, very good and terrible at the same time. "Well then," she said, pushing herself back into his personal space and slowly running her hand over his crotch, a nail dragging across his somewhat outlined dick in his pants. "If that's the best kiss you've had all year, I wonder what this would do for you." If Brett wasn't already stiff as a board in his slacks, he was now. Painfully so. And also very aware of the fact that she was someone else's wife. British aristocracy, at that. With an intense amount of effort, he stepped back, taking her hand gently and moving it. "Lady Fiona," he said lowly, doing his best to try and make her understand that this was not okay. Or worse still, more than okay, but a stunningly bad idea for him. "I really think..." She just started laughing. "Oh, get over yourself. Believe me, it wasn't going to go any further," she said teasingly. It wasn't a mean tone, just a teasing one. "I know it's wrong, and I just wanted to get a rise out of you." Then she lowered her gaze, licked her lips suggestively, and then said in breathy tone, "And it looks like I did too." Now, Brett had to get out of that room right there and then, or he'd risk having an accident, and that was not going to happen. He needed to get to his cabin right then, or bad things would happen. Things he would never live down. "Mom," he nodded at her, backtracking as fast as he could and almost stumbling over the door jamb, seeing her amused look on her face as he basically ran away. He left the cabin, shutting the door, then leaned up against the wall next to the entrance, breathing heavily and wondering what he'd done in a past life to deserve this. Oh, that evening was going to be a lively one in his cabin, for sure. Did he have any hand lotion left? He got back to his cabin just in time for his phone to buzz, indicating that the captain needed the Lady Fiona up in the bridge, since the call she needed had been arranged, and the people to be called were waiting. He groaned, shrugged and went back to her cabin, knocking on her door. "Yes," he heard her call as she opened the door, looking sweaty and a little bedraggled and just generally very sexy. "Watch it. The call is ready for you. You can take it here." He gestured at her phone. "Or up in the bridge. Up to you." She stared at him for a moment, then made a snap decision. "Down here is fine. Can you ask the captain to pipe it down? Thank you, Brett." Brett just nodded and turned back to his cabin. He called the captain and then sat down, wondering how that call was going. The next day, Brett was up early, despite having done his shift of 4-hour bridge time. Brett had learned early in his naval career that you take naps when you can, and not to expect a solid 8 hours every night. He, like all merchant seamen, could exist off cat naps taken when he was able. He stood outside Fiona's cabin door, wondering what she had in store for him that day, and entreating the Lord to let him get through the day without embarrassing himself. He raised his hand to knock on the door. He never got the chance to actually make contact as the door flew open and Fiona bounded out, almost knocking him over. She was in a tight white outfit, t-shirt with open armholes, some kind of sports bra underneath, tight pants and what looked like ankle warmers on her feet, rounded off with white sneakers on her feet. She stood in front of him, swapping weight from one foot to the other, clearly warming up for some exercise. "Good morning, Brett. Come on, the daylight is a-wasting. We are going to for a run. I can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to this. I had a marvellous sleep and feel tons better, and am really ready for this. Now go put on your workout togs, there's a good chap. Chop chop," was all delivered in rapid staccato, with a look of benevolent expectation on her face. Brett just stared at her. Her hair was pulled back at the back of her head, with a clip, making her face quite severe, but highlighting her cheekbones and showing off her magnificent eyes. She wore no makeup, but it was clear that she didn't need it. Her skin was porcelain white and clear of any blemish apart from the bruise. It was all he could do not to just reach out and grab her and kiss her. He was so mesmerized. "Come on, man. The day is passing, get with it," she admonished. Brett was sure she knew what kind of effect she was having on him and delighting in teasing him this way. Particularly when she said, "I'll just wait here and stretch while you go get changed," and then bent down, presenting her absolutely astonishingly pert and perfect backside to him as she went to touch her toes. He pulled himself together. He was a merchant marine seaman, and by God, he wasn't going to go all gaga over a woman. Get it together, man. Averting his eyes and muttering about sirens under his breath, he retreated to his cabin to change into shorts, a t-shirt and some running shoes, not even considering whether he should just tell her no or not. 5 minutes later, he opened his door to find her leaning against the door jamb, arms folded, smirk on her face. "Ready now, slow boy," she taunted. "Come on, last one around buys breakfast," she shouted, and took off, running down the narrow corridor. Brett just walked out of his cabin, closed the door, and stood, waiting, till Fiona returned 10 seconds later, red-faced, because the direction she ran in only took them to a stairwell that went down into the infrastructure of the ship. "Yes, well," she said, with a determined, if pained, look on her face. "Fine. You lead the way then, Macduff." And she gestured at him to go in the other direction, Brett doing his very best to maintain his stone face. Brett led her out of the tail-end infrastructure of the ship, where the quarters and other crew facilities were, down to the actual exterior. This ship, while laden down with shipping containers, piled on top of each other, 8 levels high, towering above the deck. The deck itself was fully loaded, with a narrow channel around the edges, just wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. When they got out into the outside, It was fairly cold, and Brett stopped Fiona from just taking off, explaining that they needed to run single file, since while the channel was wide enough for them run together, there was various items of equipment that would jut out and make it difficult. As it is, this is an older vessel, he explained, as he started stretching out his legs, concentrating on each different muscle group. The newer ones actually don't have this ledge. They have a channel that goes underneath the containers. The containers are loaded to the edge, on top of a supporting infrastructure, and there is a deck beneath them that runs around the edge of the ship, like those old strolling decks you see on some of the old timeliners. Really? Asked Fiona. How astonishing. Don't those containers weigh tons? Well, yes, but the supporting structure is part of the boat's infrastructure, answered Brett. They can support the weight and not collapse because it's actually the frame of the ship itself holding them up. Replied Fiona with a nod. Okay, I'm warm, you ready? Asked Brett. As I'll ever be. 5 times, yes? So, let's do, 3 miles? Think you can keep up, big boy? She teased him. Look, Fiona, Brett said seriously, putting out an arm to stop her taking off. Please understand you haven't run in a while. You are getting over a major life event, and you are likely going to be tired out. Let's take it easy and see how it goes, okay? Fiona smiled at him indulgently, if even haughtily. Yeah, eat my dust, Yank. And ducking under his arm, she was off. The trail was easy to follow, and she maintained a decent pace. Brett was fine being behind her, since she could then set the pace, and also, he got to look at her magnificent arse as it jiggled around, surprisingly firm. He could watch her glutes and see her form as she ran. As it was, they were both soon warm, and as the sun came up from the horizon, the day got warmer, and they were both soon sweating. Fiona managed 4 loops before having to slow and walk, obviously out of breath. Brett could hear her talking to herself, cajoling and castigating her performance. He refrained from trying to talk to her, regulating his own breathing and keeping up his own pace. After then 8th time around, Fiona stopped, arm out, leaning against the exterior wall, breathing heavily. Sorry, she gasped, taking lungfuls of breath. Very out of shape. It seems. It's fine, said Brett. I normally don't do more than a couple of miles a day, he added, which was a total lie since he normally did at least 3 to 4 miles whenever he could, but which was designed to give her an easy out, so she didn't overly tax herself this early in her recovery. He didn't need a relapse just because she was ultra-competitive, especially when it was obvious she was. Fiona wasn't taken in for a second. She glanced back at him, a sullen look on her face. Don't BS me, boy. I know when I'm being talked down to. He just shrugged and said, Okay, well, once more around then. Yes, I think that will be fine, she replied haughtily, flipping her face at him. Come on, slow coach. She managed 2 more loops before stopping again to draw breath. I think that's all for now, she managed to get out. Brett grinned at her. Well, you've already done far more than most of the crew do here, so don't feel bad, he said, eyes twinkling at her. You've been shipwrecked and you still show most of this lot up. She smiled gratefully at him and said, Aren't you just a sweet one? While looking right into his eyes, and, it felt to him, into his soul. Shaking it off, he suggested they walk back to their cabins, and as they did so, he noticed she was limping. He looked at her quizzically and she replied, wincing, Shin splints. Always had them when I run. Wish I could do something about them. Oh, that's not a hard thing to fix, he said airily, as they walked slowly down the edge of the ship. Fiona looked hard at him suspiciously. Oh, you just happen to have that fix, do you? I did 8 years of ballet buster and none of them could fix it. But you have the secret to the universe, yes? They teach that on this rust bucket, she demanded. Well, no, but I learned this from a Nigerian we used to have on the crew, he answered cautiously. He still couldn't tell when Fiona was genuinely annoyed versus pulling his leg. "Basically, lean back," he added. "When you run, I mean. Lean back as you do it. It'll feel stupid to you and you'll feel like an idiot, but it'll stop the shin splints from bothering you." Fiona stopped walking and looked at him like he was an idiot. "Seriously?" "Well, yeah. Think about it. Shin splints come about because of undue amounts of pressure on the front of the shin. That pressure comes from the impact of the weight of your body over the foot. Now, you can't stop that entirely, but leaning back does two things. Firstly, it distributes the weight more evenly over your legs. The back leg takes more of it, and secondly, it actually forces the downstroke leg to be a little more vertical, so the weight goes down the shin, not over it." Fiona thought it over and continued walking. "Okay, let's say I try it. If I find it doesn't work and you are pulling my leg so I can look stupid when running, then you'll regret it, Buster," she exclaimed. "Still, if it does work, I'll love you forever." He glanced at her and saw a hint of a mischievous smile, half flirty and half silly. Then she winced as she too another step, and he immediately moved in, concerned. "Here, let me," he said, pulling her arm around his shoulder. "Yeah, you just want to get close to me, don't you, sailor boy? Been too long since you saw a woman, eh?" she teased. Brett didn't know how he could answer that without a sarcastic or inappropriate comment, so he just kept quiet. When they got back to the cabin, Brett offered Fiona a leg massage, knowing it was verging on the inappropriate. But he was duty-bound to offer succor, he reasoned. And if he got to touch her legs, well, so be it. It was up to her anyway. She looked at him appraisingly with a smirk on her face. "Yeah, right, do I get a happy ending?" she asked, twinkle in her eye. "You'll get a spanking if you carry on like that," Brett answered without thinking, taking a chance. "Ooh, promises, promises," she answered back, tumbling onto her bed. She extended a foot. "You may approach the royal foot surf," she exclaimed in her plummy, posh accent. "But be warned, these feet are to be admired and worshipped. Nothing else will do," she intoned imperiously. Brett knelt down and took one foot in his hand, unlacing her shoes and taking it off, making a pantomime over the smell from her feet. Outraged, Fiona declared, "This shall not do. The royal feet smell divine. How dare you, peasant? Off with his head, I say. To the executioner, immediately." Brett grinned up at her, and then started massaging her calf muscles. He could feel the tension and knots in her legs, and worked on them, slowly, one muscle group at a time. Fiona instantly shut up, and leaned back into the pillows of the bunk. Apart from a small, "ah," escaping from her lips, and a look of ecstasy, she was silent, allowing his hands free roam over both lower legs. Brett did one leg, then, removing the shoe, did the other. Then he alternated, one foot, then the other. Fiona didn't move, eyes closed, just making occasional whimpers. Brett remembered having to do this for his mother years ago. He remembered her instructing him in the best way to foot massage, where to be soft and where to knead hard. He couldn't help but remember her telling him it was a skill he'd come to be thankful for. In the future, and at the time, he couldn't imagine how. Now, he understood. He knelt before Fiona for at least 10 minutes, massaging her feet, the balls, the toes, the ankle, her calf muscles and shins, and Fiona was, at this point, utter putty in his hands. Her skin was going red, and her eyelids fluttering under his ministrations. "You want me to go higher?" he asked tentatively. One did not just lay hands on the thighs of British royalty, no matter how far removed, without at last asking permission first. "Oh God, yes!" groaned Fiona, clearly in a world of her own at this point. Brett licked his lips, wondering if this was a good idea. He'd made the suggestion now, and needed to follow up, but his own internal compass was warring with his desire for this woman. She was someone else's wife, but by God she was responding and he was absolutely into her. What was it the British say? In for a penny, in for a pound. Well, at this point he was in for about 14 tons. Tentatively, he moved his hands higher on her legs, gently kneading the tendons below and above her kneecaps. More soft moans were elicited from Fiona. Then, very slowly, move up to the thigh. She was still wearing the skin-tight pants, and it made it easy for him to feel the movement of the muscles underneath. Fiona, at this point, had raised herself on elbows and was gazing down at him through hooded eyes. "You are very good at this, aren't you?" she said softly. He stopped and shrugged. "Blame a mother who was on her feet all day. She came home and just wanted a massage, so I learned how. Don't get to do this very often, though." "What? All the hunky sailors here not clamouring for your magic touch?" she teased, laughing gently at him. "Not as such, no," he replied, thankfully. "Well, what are you waiting for? Get to it," she said, after they stared at each other for a moment. "Want to turn over? I can do your shoulders and back too." "Oh, you wonderful man. I wish I could bottle you. My friends would pay through the nose for you," she husked, turning herself over and flattening herself out on the bed. Brett moved up and started massaging her through her billowing t-shirt. "Wait," she said, pushing herself up and taking the t-shirt off, revealing the sports bra underneath. "Make it easier." At this point, Brett wished he had oils or hand warmers to do the job properly. But he was a merchant seaman. He would make do. It was in his job description pretty much. He worked on her shoulders, the outside, then inside. Then the knots in her shoulder blades. This is where a lot of the tendons in the back come together, since that's what shoulder blades exist for, to act as anchors for lots of the tendons. Inevitably, they end up with knots, and since they are so close to the surface, they are generally easier to work out. Then he moved down to the lower back. Fiona had plenty of knots there too, which after her experiences was to be expected. The trick was to be gentle. The spine was right there, and there were plenty of places where nerves extended from between vertebrae that needed to be treated with extreme care. And then, gulp, the lower back, at the top of her perfect tush. "Oh my God," he thought. "I'm actually laying hands on this woman's ass. She's related to the Queen of fucking England, for God's sake." He risked a quick glance up at her head. Some people are fast asleep from this kind of work over by now. Was she? No, she was awake. He was aware her eyes were open, and the one he could see was regarding him, unblinking. More gulping. He went as low as he dared, and then came back up again. "Lower," she husked, suddenly speaking. Lower, I said. Or do I have to come up there and tell you with the voice? Aren't you supposed to be making me happy?" "Well, yes, but..." "Then make me happy, slave. Now, please." There was nothing for it. Off to the races, then. He slid his hands an inch lower. More. Another inch. "I'll tell you when. Keep going." Now his hands were almost full of ripe peach globes. There was no way this wasn't deliberate. "Keep your mind on the job," he reminded himself, gritting his teeth and adjusting his position so his rapidly expanding erection didn't poke into the delicious body underneath him. Once his hands were completely full of delectable ass, or arse, as she would put it, she murmured, "That's it, that's the spot," and he was left massaging her butt cheeks. Her breathing increased in frequency and depth, and the murmurs increased in intensity too. "Yes, there, that's it," she muttered, squirming her torso around. Brett was now stuck. When did he stop massaging? When was appropriate? Should he just move his hands back up her torso? What was the etiquette here? When massaging a member of the British royal family on the butt, when did you finish and how did you disengage without causing offence? Was bowing or curtsying involved? In the end, after a couple of minutes, he moved his hands gently back up her torso, and then, after kneading her back and giving her shoulders another rub, he sat back. "All done, ma'am," he murmured. Fiona sighed heavily and then levered herself up, staring at him, unblinking. "Oh my God. Felicity would just eat you up," she said, almost to herself. "Not that I'd allow her the chance." She rolled over onto her back, one hand up behind her head regarding Brett. She was, to him, the spectre of loveliness, bruises be damned. The hair, starting to escape from the bundle behind her head, dregs of it down one side of her face. Her face flush, her lips pursed, a perfect and lithe body. Brett sat as still as he could, trying to make sure she couldn't see, or worse still, feel, his erection that was rapidly making its presence felt. The shorts he wore were baggy, and so it wasn't as constrained as it should have been. She only had to look down or brush a hand against him, and there it was, needing to be explained. "You really are very cute, you know that?" she said at last. "Come here," and she beckoned him down to her. This presented Brett with a conundrum. If he pushed himself down to face her, she'd feel his dick. The only way to do what she asked was to move himself back. He hesitated, and losing her patience, Fiona suddenly lunged up at him, saying, "I said, come here!" And then, rolling her free hand around his head, pulled him to her, kissing him with fervour. There was no doubt she was now encountering his erection, in all its covered glory. The biggest problem was that Fiona was a hell of a kisser, and Brett just wanted more. She was exciting, interesting, passionate, attractive, and just one hell of a package. So he kissed her back, and resigned himself to the fact that she'd know his arousal. Which, if he was thinking about it, would have been inevitable at that point regardless. But men don't think about women are thinking about in situations like that. There's only enough blood to consider their side of the equation. She hungrily kissed him, almost growling at him. Her mouth opened and her tongue darted in to caress his. This was no peck. This was the kind of kissing they teach at horse school. One of her hands was behind his neck, holding his head to hers, and the other roamed his body, finally clamping down on his, now painful, erection, squeezing it and groping him. Eventually she pushed him back, breathing heavily, staring into his eyes, mouth open, tongue running around her lips. "Kit off, now," she ordered, pulling her sports bra off with a two-handed crossover. Brett just stared. Her perfect Just C-cup breasts popped out, large nipples erect and puffed out. She licked her lips again and then repeated the word, "now," with urgency. Brett knew it was wrong. She belonged to someone else. But she was here. He was there. They both so desperately wanted it, and it had been a long few months. Before he knew it, he was shrugging out of his clothes, his 7-inch steel bar cock bouncing out of his brief as he pulled them down, Fiona tugging hungrily from the front. "Oh yes, that'll do," murmured Fiona breathlessly, before she pounced on it, mouth open, engulfing the glands. Brett's back arched as the tip of his cock vanished into the velvety recesses of Fiona's mouth. She started working on, with gusto, slurping on it, and out, tongue running up and down the shaft, inhaling the scene of his balls before rubbing them on her face and then slobbering on them. There was no chance she wasn't enjoying this. Occasionally she'd look up and meet his eye with her gaze, with a twinkle in her eye. The sensations from her ministrations to his dick were mind-blowing. He had to start thinking about navigation issues to stop from blowing his load almost immediately. Eventually she pulled his dick from her mouth, grinned up at him and said, "Been a while for you, has it, sailor?" Not trusting himself to speak, he just nodded. "Well, imagine how it's been for me. Months on my own, and then thinking I was going to die at sea. Look at this as a celebration of life." And with that, she engulfed his member again, going back to town on it. Brett sucked in a breath again. He wasn't going to last long at this rate. Knowing how bad etiquette it was to just blast into a partner's mouth with no warning, no matter how enthusiastic they might be. So he groaned, and did his best to push her back a bit, when he started feeling the tightening indicative of his balls. Gently, trying to lift her off, she backed off, wiping her lips with the back of her hand, Yummy, she sparkled. Yes, thanks, that... Before he was able to get a complete sentence out, she rolled on her back, spread her legs and said, Now, I have a fire here, and I need you in there, now. Show me what you've got, sailor boy. It's been months and I need to put out this fire, and you're elected. A confusing mismatch of idioms, but she made her point very eloquently. Part of Brett's mind recognised that this was almost certainly a delayed reaction to the situation she'd been in. While she had a stiff upper British lip, it couldn't help but affect her, and her present desire was without a result of an emotional reaction. But while that was echoing at the back of his brain, at the front of it was a hot woman, demanding him to satisfy her. A woman he really, really liked. So... Without thinking anymore, he leaned forward and guided his rock-hard cock into her willing and very wet folds. She moaned as he pushed in and sank deep into her, and he let go of a breath he didn't know he was holding. Fiona moaned again, then pushed back. She felt like liquid fire around his cock. He'd never been with a woman with such internal heat before, and it was an amazing sensation. Slowly, he started to stroke it in and out, longer and deeper each stroke. He looked down at Fiona and saw she had her eyes open, staring back at him, face creased in pleasure, mouth in a round, open shape, lips pursed, her eyelids fluttering each time he pushed into her. Harder, she cried, arching her back and offering herself up to him even more. Both realised this was not love-making. This was lust, passion, raw desire, need, on both their parts. Neither was reading more into this than was there at that moment. They both needed this, and by God, they were going to get it. Brett also realised that at this point he wasn't going to last long. He just wanted to be sure she got off first. Luckily, he picked up on her movements. She was arching as he pushed in, and he reached around and started rubbing his thumb across her clit, lightly touching it on the outstroke and pushing hard on the instroke. Fiona now was reduced to guttural moans, and she started trembling, her moans getting higher and her breathing getting shorter, her face and upper chest flushed red. Hard, please, harder. I need... She moaned, her head lolling to one side, and one had grabbed and pinched her breasts, going back and forth, pinching a nipple and then rubbing them. 6 more thrusts and she was there. Her body arched, she cried out, a long cry of, "Oh, oh, oh!" And then she fell back, his cock still firmly embedded and her trembling like a leaf. Her breathing slowly returned to normal, and she looked up at him, sly smile on her face. Oh Christ, I needed that. I almost never come that way. A strange thing to share at that precise moment, but Brett gave her a moment to subside, and then started again. Slowly, long, powerful strokes, pushing her legs up and wide to give him more access. Oh, she murmured, and he started to increase the pace. Her breathing again started to get laboured, and it was clear she was on her way to second orgasm. Brett counted himself lucky. He'd never had a multi-orgasmic woman before. This was a first for him. He was wondering if he could orchestrate it so they came together when Fiona came to his aid, putting her own finger on her clit while he pounded away. Oh yes, come for me, big boy. Fill my pussy. I want to feel you spurt. The dirty talk, in the passion of the moment, from a refined British accent, was enough to spur him on. He pounded and banged, the sweat starting to drip down his forehead, an expression of determination and power on his face. Fiona started to writhe again under him, pushing herself forward, saying phrases like more, fuck me, push that hard cock into this dirty pussy, evidently getting as much off it herself as he was. And inevitably, he felt it start. The moment the muscles start to contract, the loss of control, the heady feeling of ejaculation, and he just spurted into her. The ropes of cum throbbed out, time and again. He felt her also arch, her fingers moving furiously as she rode her climax to its conclusion at the same time. Another first for Brett, a simultaneous orgasm. He sat back on his hunches, his cock still engorged, and pointing obscenely at the ceiling as it pulled out of Fiona. She stopped writhing and her breathing slowly subsided, as did his. And then the awkwardness began, as the realization of what he'd just done set in. She was married. He'd made her cheat. She belonged to someone else. And he'd just had sex with her, unprotected. Jesus, unprotected at that. Christ almighty, how stupid could he be? He was better than this, but something about this woman, something made him lose control. He looked down at her, hoping she wasn't watching the expressions march across his face. She was looking at him, with much the same kind of facial expression revealing the same kinds of thoughts. Well, fuck. How does a guy extricate himself from a situation like this, without it being awkward? And he did have to basically be her companion for the rest of the time on the ship. One thing was for sure. He couldn't presume on her. She obviously had her own demons to work out, and his presence was not the thing for that. When she sat and thought about it, she'd be so pissed at him for taking advantage. He just needed to give her space. He stuttered, not knowing the right thing to say. "Oh, it's fine, more than fine," she murmured languidly. "Look, I think I need to go. I think... Yes. Look, let's, just talk later. Or something." He was totally falling over his own words. He needed to get out. He'd just done something utterly reprehensible, and she was going to realize it. God knows what the captain was going to say once she told him. Gathering up his clothes, he pulled on his pants and stumbled out the cabin door, the light outside hurting his eyes. Good thing his cabin was only a few doors away. Less chance of seeing any of the crew seeing him as they wandered off to the refectory for lunch. Lunch? Was it only lunchtime? Jesus! He got his door open, leapt in and slammed the door behind him, leaning against the door and breathing heavily. Brett looked at his enrapt audience. He had very definitely toned down most of the recounting of the actual sex event. They didn't need to hear about their mother in that way. He had stumbled over his words, tried to choose the least offensive way of telling them he had ravaged their mother, and worse still, she had encouraged it and enjoyed the hell out it. There are some things kids do not need to know about their parents' lives. Amelia leaned back and glanced at Bradley, smiling widely. "Well, go, Mum. Woo!" Bradley scowled at her. "Really, Millie?" "Oh, come on. Did you imagine for a second Mother had it in her?" "So to speak," she chuckled at her own witticism. "I mean, let's face it, Mum is not the most passionate of women. Sensible, yes. Sometimes she goes outside her comfort zone and she is calm and collected about it. Duty first. How many times had we heard that, Brad? This," she said, gesturing at Brett. "This is like someone else entirely." "Look." Brett was hesitant about continuing. "So you'd wimped out, Mum was wiped out, you scuttled away to... What? Consider your navel? What happened next?" Amelia leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands cupping her chin, eyes sparkling. She glanced up at Bradley, who shrugged, holding up his bottle of beer, gesturing for Brett to continue. Brett sat in his cabin, after taking a quick shower in the utilitarian shower unit, and dressing in a fresh uniform, such as it was. Then he sat and thought, staring at a glass of water on his table. This was not who he was. He was a merchant sailor, and while they were mostly a pretty unethical lot, he'd tried his best to retain principles. He didn't fuck whores, he didn't gamble, and most of all, he didn't screw married women. Particularly, and this bit was crucial, not minor members of the British aristocracy who were married to duchess. But he had. He'd let his dick do the thinking, and now, here he was. And, oh crap, with no protection. That bit hadn't even occurred to him yet. For all he knew, she was over there, ovulating. Oh fuck. When it rained, it poured. What to do? Did he go tell the captain? Get out ahead of it? What if she complained? I mean, he had taken advantage, hadn't he? That massage... Well, yeah, it was foreplay. He hadn't really thought about it, but now. She'd been at sea months alone. Of course it was foreplay. Jesus, what a mess. And then there was a knock at the door. Fuck. First mate come to clap him irons. What? He answered the door, and was surprised to see Fiona leaning against the door, just like first thing that morning, what seemed like all those weeks ago. Well, sailor, going to invite a girl in? She asked, a one-sided smile on her face. What? Yes, of course. It wouldn't do for any of the crew to wander by with her standing outside. Oh, course. Yes, come on. She walked in, swinging what appeared to be a six-pack of beer. Where had she gotten that? I managed to persuade Pierre to give this up, she said, holding up the six-pack. Don't ask me what I had to do to get him to let go of it. Let's just say he no longer has to wonder what both royal boobs look like. Look, Fiona, I think we need... What you need, young man, is a beer. God knows I do. Thirsty work, all that working out, yes? She handed him a can with its ring pull that came off the can, and sat back in his bunk, popping open one for herself. Ah, first beer in months. Lovely, she sighed, after taking a deep draught. Wonderful stuff. I can appreciate this. A gift from Hugh. After taking another draught and looking at him speculatively, she then chided him. Oh, come on, Brett. Open a beer, live a little, it won't kill you. A little celebration of life. That phrase again. He looked at his beer. Heineken. He remembered Pierre buying 4 cases of it at their last stop-off. He doubted much remained of it. Shrugging, he popped his open can and sat down at his small desk, tipping the can at Fiona in salute. Look, you ran off. To be honest, I fell asleep for a bit. I didn't really know what to say after that. But we need to talk. I think you are beating yourself up a bit unnecessarily, Brett. I came after you. Granted, that massage was a great opening gambit, but I came after you. Don't forget that. Your virtue is intact, such as it is. She smiled broadly at the last statement. That doesn't really make it okay, Fiona. You are married. Brett replied somewhat emphatically. Oh, is that what you were worried about? She replied nonchalantly. Brett, do you have any idea how the British royals work? How the establishment perpetuates? Ever heard the phrase arranged marriages? What? Asked Brett, sitting up straight at the thought. This is the 1980s. Almost the 1990s, that doesn't happen anymore. Fiona laughed. A tinkling laugh Brett couldn't help but notice. Her neck arched as she threw her head back, and it was really attractive, and for God's sake, get a hold of yourself, man. Yes, well, if you really believe that, I have a bridge I'd quite like to sell you, she quipped back. Look, there's this thing where I come from called the duty. It's imprinted on all royals from an early age. We live a life of privilege. Land, money, publicity, some notoriety, it's all there. But the other side of that bargain is the duty, all capitals, I'm afraid. We have to be above the herd. We have to be unimpeachable in our behaviour. We have to be available to act as heralds. We have to open fêtes and bazaars and have the photographers follow us around. We have to be what the tourists come to see, and keep our stately homes working and provide fodder for the tabloids. We don't have a choice about it. You don't get to just walk away. You're born into it, and you don't get any other choice. Lots of choices are taken from you. I can't just marry anyone. It has to be acceptable to the court. Yes, it's all very medieval, but it's still there. The United Kingdom never killed off all their nobility, like France did, so it's all still there, traditions galore, no matter how stupid they are in today's world. She took another drink and carried on, face creased with emphasis. I mean, look at Diana. I know her personally. She's the patron to the charity I was actually doing my little jaunt in my boat for. Headway. It's a charity for those with head injuries. She and I have worked together more than once. But did Charles want to marry her? Well, sure, but she certainly wasn't his first choice. He wanted some other little number, Camilla Shand, now Parker Bowles. She was always his first choice. But the Queen wouldn't have it. As Dad would say, common as muck. She was a commoner and just declared not suitable by the palace, and that was that. He had to be married to someone of his station, and Diana fit the bill. She's not wildly happy in her marriage, I can tell you, but that has more to do with how she seems to think the entire world is some Mills and Boon romance novel, and reality, well, it doesn't really measure up. She's had her little flings too, of that there is no doubt. But the point is, I'm not particularly free to marry for love. I mean, I'm not forced into something against my will, just my options are limited. Daddy more or less selected Eric for me. There was a selection of about 10 gentlemen that were deemed acceptable to carry on the dukedom, and Eric was about the best of all of them. After Hugh, well, I just went with the programme, I'm afraid.
Hugh?
Oh, Hugh, she replied, having another swig and then sighing. Love of my life he was. I mean, no question of marrying him, unfortunately. That would have given Daddy a coronary, much less Mother having a stroke. But Hugh was dashing. He had the gift of the gab, that one. Taught me all about the mysteries of love. And cricket. He did love his cricket, did Hugh. She looked off into the distance, seeing the past and revelling in it. He was such fun. A real ladies' man before me, so I'm told. He and I were inseparable. I could see Mummy and Daddy getting more and more uncomfortable about it all. If they only knew what he taught me in the stables. And then it all came to an end. She came back from the past, and then looked back at me. We were due to have the week together. He was dropping some plans at the office. He was an architect, don't you know? Anyway, he was happy about our upcoming week, drove too fast, came round a corner and his little Ford Escort smashed headlong into a lorry coming the opposite direction. He was in a coma for months, and eventually came out of it with rather a lot of brain damage. He never lived alone again, and died about 3 years later, of influenza. The charity that helped him was Headway, and it was for them that I was doing the globe circumnavigation. It was to raise funds for them. I had over $500,000 all set to be raised, although who knows what will happen now after recent events. She sighed, then patted the bunk next to her, indicating that Brett should join her. After a quick mental debate, he did. Anywho, the point is, my marriage was rather arranged. Eric is not a bad sort. He's okay, more concerned about the ancestral home and the grounds than me, most of the time, to be honest. It's not like it's any great passionate love affair, but we are British. We just get on with it, rather. It's more business partnership than anything. We are more companions than lovers, if you understand. We share a bed but the wifely duty. You've heard the expression lie back and think of England? Yes. Well, it's more accurate than you'd think. They both had another draught of the slightly warming up beer, and then she said thoughtfully, "Don't imagine you are getting in the way of a cosmic marriage, Brett. I spoke to Eric the other night as well as Daddy. You know what he wanted to know? What bloody aquarium fish food we use because he needed to replace it. That was it. He made a few noises like, 'Oh, I'm glad you're all right,' and then launched into asking questions about the damn household. That's my husband. Daddy was more concerned about my health than my husband was. He never even asked if I was injured. He wanted to know where the insurance information for the boat was." She stopped talking for a moment, breathing heavily, clearly angry. She calmed down a bit and carried on. "We are miles from anywhere, and whatever happens here, stays here. I've been on a boat for months, alone, and I thought I was going to die. I'm sure that what we did today was a reaction to that, and it's not like I'm here for the next great love affair. Okay? Take a load of your mind. It's all just good, clean, sweaty fun. No wronged husband is going to come looking for you, with a loaded blunderbuss. I'm certainly not going to worry about it, and neither should you. I'm a big girl and I'm not about to fall in love with you, and you aren't going to fall in love with me either," she said, patting my hand. Famous last words. And then she kissed him. She didn't hesitate, just grabbed his head in both hands and kissed him, hard. And despite all his internal decisions, Brett kissed her right back. And then they were suddenly naked again. And this time, they both took their time. This time, Brett explored her, delighting in making her quiver or moan or breath harder. She took him on a guided tour of her body, and he was only too happy to explore. This time, she looked into his eyes as he drove her to the edge several times. This time was for her, but in a decidedly different fashion than from before. This time, she kissed him repeatedly as he looked in her eyes as he drove his steel rod cock into her willing wet hole. This time, she held herself off, barely, so she could coincide her last orgasm with his, and when done, covered him with kisses, before dissolving gently into tears. He held her as the pressures of the past weeks came due, smothering her head with his hands, caressing her and telling her repeatedly it was going to be all right. This time they made love, and when they were done, they fell asleep, still entangled, sweaty bodies stuck together, breathing hard, and for once, Fiona did believe it was going to be all right. They slept through the night together, and Brett woke early, gently disentangling himself, smiling as a sleeping Fiona muttered to herself, blearily looking around in a sleep-deprived fashion, and instantly falling back to sleep again. He dressed and wandered off to the galley to gather breakfast, ignoring the Jezzaz from his ship Martis. They couldn't possibly know that their good-natured pokers at him, asking if his charge slept heavy or not, were actually squarely on the money and he wasn't about to enlighten them. Balancing 2 plates of bacon, eggs, toast and 2 coffees, he made his way back to his cabin and gently slipped inside, making sure no one was around when he did so. "For me," said a bleary-eyed Fiona, sniffing the air and raising herself up on one arm. "For the lady indeed," replied Brett, putting them down on his little cabin table. "A breakfast of champions, fit for a queen." "Yeah, well, I've seen what the Queen has for breakfast, dearie," replied Fiona dryly. "And it generally features a lot more yogurt and granola and a lot less artery-hardening bacon, swimming in fat." Brett looked down at his carefully carried breakfast, dubiously, the back at Fiona. "That said, though, God, that smells good." She bounded out of bed, naked and like a gorgeous nymph from heaven. "Yes, please, serve it up." She shrugged on one of his shirts and sat opposite Brett and dived into her breakfast with gusto, talking non-stop about her upbringing and schooling, and the breakfast they'd had there, in between bites. Brett just marvelled at how effortlessly sexy she was, the shirt half open, one breast present, chalky skin, with a red ruby nipple. Fiona was utterly unself-conscious, and just nattered as she ate, small bites, and always using a knife and fork, even for the toast. And then, they brought out this small birthday cake. Honestly, the most miserable thing I've ever seen. So incredibly sad, and we all had to sing happy birthday, in our nightgowns and... Eventually she realised he wasn't eating and just trailed off, staring at him inquiringly. "What?" "Just..." He stumbled, realising he'd been caught, and breaking eye contact, he dove into his own breakfast ferociously. "No, what? What were you looking at?" Fiona insisted. "You don't get to stare like that, and not tell me." Brett just mumbled with a mouthful of egg and carried on eating, doing his best to just avoid the subject. "What? You've never seen a naked woman before? Over breakfast? Come on, boy, spit it out." She pushed, leaning over the table to stare at him intently. "What is my big, brave sailor falling in love?" she teased, putting special emphasis on the word love and pronouncing it more like loo. Brett could feel himself blushing and glanced up at Fiona with pleading eyes. "Oh my God, you are," she gushed. "Brett is in love." Brett put down his utensils and, steeling himself, met her slightly mocking gaze. "Brett, this the equivalent of a week-long one-night stand. Don't be getting all mushy on me," she said, sitting back. "Look, obviously it's easier for you to separate feelings from, well, sex, than it is for me. The fact is, I'm a seaman at sea, alone, no women, and then you show up. I mean, for God's sake, you're British royalty. And then and we did, well, what we did, twice in one day, in fact. And I have no clue why me, and you are pretty gorgeous, and well, I'm just a little, I don't really know what I feel. Fiona's face softened immediately. Oh, aren't you just the sweetest thing? She cooed. She reached forward and grabbed his hand. Look, that's part of the reason for all this. You think you've had a dry spell? I've been on that boat for months now. And before that, well, it wasn't up to much. You've made me come more than at any point since I was last with Hugh. That wasn't self-induced, you know. And I'm married. That should tell you something. This was all delivered conversationally, as though it was no big thing, and Brett was still getting used to Fiona's more than forthright way of delivering heavy subjects. I barely know you, though, he mumbled, looking for the right thing to say, and trying not to sound whiny. What if this is all a big mistake? I'm having a hard enough time as it is, with you being married. I have no idea if this is right or not anymore. Let it be what it is. If you need to know more about me, just ask, she responded, picking up her coffee and putting both elbows on the table, holding the cup up to her face. Ask away. I'm an open book. Mostly. So he did. They spent the rest of the morning in the cabin just talking. Her telling him about life in the royal household and what her life entailed, and him telling her about his life, his upbringing, his mistakes, and what led him to be on the ship doing what he did. They laughed, they giggled, they told sad stories, and she regaled him with stories of her boat, her initial sailing, the pomp and ceremony, how she learned to sail as a child, first on the River Orwell and then graduating to seafaring boats from Harwich and Felixstowe, how she found the only peace she could when sailing by herself. It was not a hobby her husband desired to join, and so she sailed alone, with trips to Kent, and then further afield, like Ostend in Belgium and Dunkirk in France, and then Rotterdam and Amsterdam. Eventually she graduated to an Atlantic crossing, as part of a crew on an old-fashioned full-masted sailing ship, and then back, with a newly purchased yacht from Miami and a crew of 2. Then she spent 2 summers sailing her little toy around Europe, and once to Africa, before deciding on her big adventure, and then spending several months arranging charity sponsorship, berths at docks along her journey and supplies ready to be picked up, and generally outfitting her boat ready for the voyage. All the immense annoyance of her husband, who generally ignored the whole thing and chose not to be involved at all. And then they had lunch, went to the gym, took a stroll around the decks, and then Fiona insisted on getting a tour of the engine room, much to the Scottish lead engineer's very visible pure anger. Brett never did figure out what his issue was. Was it she was British, a member of their nobility? Or, he suspected, was it just her gender in general? No one was chummy enough with the lead engineer to dare to ask. Fiona got her tour though, since all the other engineers' mates were keen to show her around and share as much of her physical proximity as was possible, something very easy in the narrow confines of the engine room. Despite the almost audible eye-rolling of the chief engineer, and lots of sighs of annoyance, she still managed to charm the rest of the group, who were falling over themselves to be the one to explain the next valve or switch to her. It was only after about 10 minutes of her nodding thoughtfully, asking questions, and generally smiling a lot that Brett caught on to what she was doing. She was being the royal who attends, as she later described it. She was, in effect, opening a village fete, something else she had to explain to Brett, or taking a tour of a new factory. Basically, she was doing her best to pay attention so the rank and file would be pleased at her interest, what the British royal family do best. It was all Brett could do not to smile broadly as he leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching her performance. Every now and then she'd glance in his direction and nod along to whatever was being explained to her, just starting at him, daring him to laugh. Eventually the tour was done, and Fiona Eyre kissed everyone, shook hands, and wished them well, and walked with Brett back her cabin, Brett doing his best to hold in the shaking with laughter he felt. Upon the door shutting, he let it all go, one rolling belly laugh after another, and after a moment, So did Fiona. "I'm sorry," he gasped after a moment. "I know I shouldn't laugh at my shipmates, but the way you were glad handling them, it was, well, comical." "Glad handling?" asked Fiona, wiping a tear from her face and sitting down on her bed. "That's actually a new way of describing what we do. I don't think I've heard that before." "Yeah, it's what the politicians do back home. Glad handling people. Making them glad you handled them, so to speak," he answered, sitting down at the small stool by the desk. "Well, I'm sure they enjoyed being glad handled by me," said Fiona, making quotation marks around the words glad handled. "It sounds positively naughty the way you put it. Would you like me to glad handle you, big boy?" She dabbed her eyebrows up and down in a suggestive way. "Oh, you can handle me any way you want," replied Brett without thinking. "Well," replied Fiona, pursing her lips slowly at him, "now there's an opening." Brett was tempted to make another ribald comment about her openings, but refrained. Not that it mattered, because Fiona jumped off the bed, grabbed his head, kissed him hard, pulled him upright, and dragged him to the bed. "Let's see how glad you are at my handling," she murmured, feeling his cock through his regulation uniform pants. "Oh, look, he's glad. Very glad, by the feeling of him." And that's how they spent the rest of the afternoon. Brett was, in fact, ready for sleep that evening, quite worn out by Fiona's somewhat extreme appetite. It felt very much she had recovered from her ordeal, and was out to make up for lost time, at least when it came to physical exertion. Around 9 o'clock, after failing to get him up for a 5th time, Brett went to the galley to see what he could scare up for food, and got a very hard stare from Pierre, but managed to scrounge some chicken sandwiches, a couple of Cokes and a bag of chips. Or crisps, as Fiona put it. They snacked together at the little table, making jokes at each other's expense, moving pretty quickly into your mother jokes, where Brett found that Fiona actually had quite a reserve of these kinds of jokes. Eventually he quizzed her on it and she shrugged, her mouth full of chips, and eventually explained that the boarding school she'd been sent to had their own quirks, and a good sense of humour and memory for jokes was essential. When they'd finished, Brett stood to go. Fiona looked at him quizzically and he smiled ruefully at her. "I honestly don't think I've got another one in me. You've exhausted the supply for now. I need rest, my lady." She smiled back at him toothily and said, "It's okay. I had just hoped," and patted the bed where she had moved to. "Stay?" she asked hopefully. "I don't know that's a good idea." He hesitated, thinking about if anyone came looking for him. Not being found in his bunk would not be a good idea. "Please," she implored, patting the bed again. "I would really like to wake up next to you. Come on, you know you want to. There might be a nighttime emergency, and don't you want to be handy if there is?" He could quite imagine what kind of nighttime emergency she was thinking of, if the afternoon's activities were anything to be judged. He bit his lip. She was really attractive, and wanted him, and it's not like he'd had any other offers in the past few months. "Please," she could see he was wavering. "Fine," he said, rolling his eyes and acting like he was doing her a massive favour. "But I'd better be made a knight of the round table when we dock," he muttered, as he shrugged out of his shirt and pants. Waking up in the morning was a revelation for Brett. While he'd done it before, it had mostly been after one-night stands. He'd had one longer-term relationship with an old friend from school that had lasted a couple of months, but she'd made it clear that she wasn't happy with him shipping out as a merchant marine crewman, and that had been that. Sleeping next to a sleeping woman, particularly in the narrow cabin beds the ship had, meant close proximity. It meant her hand and face on his chest, breathing slowly. He glanced down, craning his head so he could see without moving or disturbing Fiona, and saw the blanket was dislodged. She was bathed in the light from the porthole, revealing her unblemished and soft skin. She looked divine, natural and innocent, even though he had first-hand knowledge that she was not. He could get used to this, which was a dangerous thought. And then she opened her eyes and caught his as the first thing she saw, and she smiled at him, A pure, open, no bullshit smile. Nothing else behind it, but delight to see him. No pretense, no other thought but pleasure at him being the first thing she saw when she woke up. And something shifted in Brett. Something moved. Suddenly, looking at her, meeting her eyes, was the most important thing in the world. In a split second, Brett was lost, and he was only dimly aware he was. They stared at each other for what felt like hours. Eventually, Fiona yawned and stretched. "What's on the agenda today?" she murmured, and Brett suddenly reared up and smothered her mouth with his, because it was suddenly extremely urgent that he kiss this woman, right there and then. Fiona was surprised but went with it, breaking apart after a few moments and panting, not entirely from lack of breath either. "Well, someone is keen, and a good morning to you too." She grinned at him, eyes shining. "I'm sorry. I just," replied Brett, suddenly bashful, aware he'd overstepped the mark. "Oh no, don't stop now," Fiona demanded. "This is a great way to wake up. More, please." And he kissed her again, and she kissed him back, and something passed between them that both were aware of, and neither could articulate. The rest of the morning was spent, predictably, in bed. The next few days saw Fiona charming the crew, and finding things to do to liven the ship up. One day she decided to host a scavenger hunt, putting the available crew into teams of 3, and sending them out to gather items from A to Z inside of 2 hours. They gathered in the mess hall for an official judging, where she awarded a case of beer, similarly charmed out of Felipe. She hosted a movie night, where they sat and watched some of the well-worn videotapes, where she, Brett and Felipe provided running, and somewhat amusing, commentary, Mystery Science Theatre 3000, 25 years too early. One evening, Brett surprised her with dinner on the deck in the bows, as far forward as he could get the table. They sat and ate, watching the water, and the sun set to the west, toasting each other with beer and the 1 bottle of wine Brett had stashed in his cabin. Another evening, she hosted her own version of the Generation game, a popular game show in the UK, where average people were shown a specialist job once, and then had to attempt that job themselves, and were then judged by the experts who'd shown them what to do. She had the crew trying to replace a filter in the kitchen, make a soufflé, handle a Morse code message using a heliograph lamp, and a bunch of ballet moves only she could achieve. It was all very silly, and most of the crew were drunk at the end of it, which only made it more hilarious. Brett was astonished that she managed to cajole the crew into doing it at all. But Fiona had that no-nonsense attitude, with a large dose of cheek that just assumed you were going to do what she wanted anyway, and all she had to do was shame you into it. Brett was still given a few shifts of work, and one evening, when he returned to his cabin, he found Fiona dressed only in one of his shirts, leaning out with a bottle of wine in her hand, God knows where she got it from, winking at him vivaciously and saying, "Hey sailor, see anything you like?" The sex went from frantic to slow and gentle, and got more and more meaningful. There were little touches, murmurs of delight, small pet names for each other, sly smiles, shared jokes, faked outrage, and one fight they had, regarding her desire to not have to talk to her husband on the radio phone link again. Brett couldn't quite believe he was the one telling her she had to do it. There was a sense of irony about that was not lost on him. There was tired sex, silly sex, lustful sex, comfort sex, and meaningful sex. It was only the night before they were due to dock in Hong Kong when Brett was on watch on the bridge, and the first mate spelled him, nodding and smiling slyly, when he said, "I'm sure you've got better things to do, yes?" and then winked at him, and Brett realised that the rest of the crew were aware of this relationship. He nodded, red-faced, and was about to leave when the first mate laid his hand on his shoulder and said, "Lad, I know it's great now, but you know she's leaving in 2 days, yes? This is not going to last. Make sure you know where your heart is, because she'll only break it if you let her." Brett wasn't about to have that conversation. He didn't know the first mate anywhere near well enough to bare his soul, plus he had no idea of his own feelings. So he just nodded, said, "Yes, sir," and left the bridge. But he didn't go back to his cabin immediately. He went for a walk around the main deck, stopping in the bows to look at the black water and to try and sort through his own feelings. He knew this was just a pleasant interlude, didn't he? Of course he did. He was a career merchant seaman. She was the British royal family. Of course there was nothing else to this. She was pretty, sure, and clever, and funny, and damn, she was hot stuff in bed, and she made him feel like a man, for certain. But part of that was just infatuation, attachment syndrome. He'd been part of the crew who rescued her from certain death. Of course she was grateful. He could take it or leave it, obviously. Except, she was awfully pretty. And damn, she was fun, and clever, and hot in bed. Wait, he'd said that already. He'd be fine, though, once she was gone. He wouldn't miss her. Well, he would miss her. Anyone would miss the sex, that's a given, right? But that's all, right? It's not like he would marry her. It was just a summer romance kind of thing. A shipboard fling. That's all it was. It wasn't like he loved her or anything. Right? Fuck. Brett sighed heavily. One thing Brett tried not to be was a liar to himself. The fact is, they hadn't been having sex in the past couple of nights. They'd been making love, maintaining eye contact, doing things for each other, just because they knew the other person liked it. Double fuck. The thing is, he knew all this. He just wasn't going to admit it. He also knew he couldn't afford to feel this way, because she was leaving. She was married, for God's sake, and she sure as shit wouldn't have felt the same about him. She had her duty, the all-pervading duty, and a husband, and a life. Triple fuck. Should he tell her how he felt? What would be the point? Still, wasn't life supposed to be all about being true to himself? Being real? Yeah, no. Brett wrestled with his innermost feelings back and forth. What to do? What to say? Anything at all. And then, while he was leaning on the railing, staring sightlessly out to sea, an arm slipped into his, and he was aware of a warm body settling next to him. Penny for your thoughts? Or in your case, since you are a Yank, $1? He breathed in her scent. While she wore no perfume, Fiona smelled of clean and crisp and jasmine somehow. Just thinking. Yes, I gathered that. Why else would you be staring all moodily out to sea? Are you practicing for a Smiths music video? And there it was, her humour, which punctuates even a good moody moment. He smiled and turned around to her. Just wrestling with the witchness of the why, my lady. She tilted her head at him and gazed up, unblinking. Yes, you are, aren't you? Well, don't let me stop you. And she turned and leaned on the railing next to him, gazing out to sea herself, staring into the future. He turned back and just breathed for a moment. And then she dropped a bomb and said quietly, "Yes, I love you too." Brett drew in a breath, stunned. There was silence for a moment while he desperately tried to work out what to say. They just stared out at the Black Sea until he broke the silence. Here's the thing, Fiona." And she turned to him and said passionately, "Now, look here, Brett. I know you feel it too, and I know damn well you can't afford to. I know I can't. But I do, and you do too, and it's just the way it is. I'm going to have to walk down that gangplank and back to my life in a day or so, and you'll sail on, and we'll both have to deal with our hearts being broken." She paused for breath. "God knows I didn't ask for this, and I'm pretty sure you didn't either. It's gotten out of hand, far more than I could have predicted. But here we are, and we have to acknowledge it." There was more silence as Brett struggled to work out the right thing to say. "If you don't say something soon, mister, I'm going to tip you into the drink. Don't let me bare my heart and you just ignore it," she threatened. "I honestly don't know what to say, Fiona," Brett said, turning to look at her. The gentle wind on the bows was flipping her hair up, and he reached out to tuck it behind her ear. She grabbed his hand and rubbed his palm on her cheek. "What do you want me to say? You want me to tell you I love you? I love you. There, I said it. I love you. I love you. And I'm a merchant sailor, and you're a member of the aristocracy, and never the twain shall meet. We are the ultimate in ships passing in the night. Brett's voice was brittle at the end, and he looked away. Yeah, bloody unfair, isn't it? Fiona answered laconically. You might say, Brett hissed bitterly. I don't know how to handle this either, Brett, Fiona said gently. I have to go back to a marriage I don't really want to be in, to a life of duty. I mean, these few days with you, they are like a bubble in my life. I wouldn't exactly call it a holiday, not for what I went through to get here. But saying that, I would do it again, for these days with you. She moved in close to him, and grasped his arm, pulling it around her body and moulding herself to him, holding his arm in place. And don't say you wouldn't either. At the end of the day, Brett, are we better for having done this? For having these feelings? Or worse? I chose to believe we are better. I have something to measure life against now. You've made me feel things that I've never felt before, that I never thought I'd ever feel. And here it is, Thunderbolt City. There was more silence. Brett wasn't struggling to find the right thing to say. He was just drinking in the moment. He was standing with his arm around his woman, his love, looking out at the endless ocean. The thing is, she started to utter, then stopped. Look, you know, this has to end, right? I have the duty. I have to return to the life. There is no future. God knows I wish there were, but there isn't. She paused again. Yeah, and I think we need to make a clean break after this, you know? She turned to look at him, staring him in the eye, to be sure he was getting the message, and understood why. We need to make it quick and brutal, like ripping off a plaster, she said. He looked at her quizzically. Band-Aid, I think you call them. He nodded. He got the point. No trying to follow the other, no stalking. You go on with your life and I'll go on with mine, and we don't. Look, back. She poked him the chest with each word to punctuate her meaning. You don't suddenly show up in England, and I won't show up. Well, anywhere you are. Promise me, Brett. Promise me you'll let this go. Treat this time we had as hallowed ground and never tread on it again. Brett just stared at her. Promise me, she hissed with intent. I don't want either one of us to regret this time, but we have to end it, and have a pact. Brett turned away and leaned on the railing, and not looking at her, nodded. Not what he wanted, but he got her point. They were too different. Eventually, he said, You've destroyed me for any other relationship, you know. I'm serious. How am I going to find another you? I should think so too, she retorted, smiling again, hesitantly, and then turned into him and pulled his head down into a kiss. I'm one of a kind, and don't you forget it. They kissed again, and it started to get more urgent, more passionate. She broke it off, and flushed said, Let's take this back to the cabin. We have one more day. Let's make the most of it. And taking him by the hand, she pulled him down the edge of the deck back to the cabin block. The last I saw of your mother, she was walking down the gangplank, scarf around her neck, oversized sunglasses. She looked like she was just getting off the Royal Yacht Britannia, rather than having just narrowly escaped death a few days before. Brett sighed as he remembered. I couldn't even accompany her. No risk of impropriety, you see. I, like everyone, watched from the deck above, just a face in the crowd. She did turn around at the bottom and look for me, but there's no way she would have been able to make me out. There was a surprising number of photographers there, way more Caucasian faces that you'd expect, for a Chinese port. I suspect the UK press had flown some of their guys out there. Naturally, she played up to them all. That was the last I saw of her in the flesh. Some guy came by in a Range Rover for her things later in the day. We stayed in port for a full 2 weeks, way longer than usual. The owners and chairman of the line who owned the ship flew in, and with the captain, they milked the press for all it was worth. And then, when the furor died down, we loaded up and slipped out of port, bound for New Zealand. Brett tried to take another drink from his already empty bottle, and looking at it suspiciously, he put it down, and making eye contact with both his children, finished up saying, "I spent the next 15 years going around the world, ship to ship. Ended up a first mate before I retired here. I followed your mother's life for about 6 months. Your press sure does intrude on you guys, doesn't it? After 6 months of abject misery, and discovering she was pregnant with you two. Well, my sanity couldn't take it anymore, so I just let it go. Left her to her life, to the duty she chose. I mean, I get it. She didn't have much of a choice, but still. She was the great love of my life. Those 10 days literally spoiled me for the rest of my life. I tried to make things work with other women, other relationships, you know. But they just didn't measure up. I knew it was me with the problem, but what can you do?" He paused, looking out at the sea view. "And then I met Caroline, who was every bit as damaged and disappointed at life as I was. She had her own story and demons to battle, like me. We gravitated together and made a life, giving each other the space to grieve for the things we'd lost. And here I am, and then you showed up. Talk about reopening old wounds," he finished ruefully. The kids sat back as he wound down, glancing at each other meaningfully. "Well, she didn't forget you either. I mean, so many things made sense after Daddy died, and she sat us down and told her version of that story. When we were growing up, our bedrooms were all nautical themed. We'd get little Airfix models. You know, the little plastic models kids make, of planes and boats and whatnot. Well, all ours would be merchant ships. We never understood till now," Amelia said after a while, grabbing hold of Brett's hand. "Yes," agreed Bradley. "Every other holiday we'd go on cruise. She used to sit on the little verandas the suites we had were graced with, and have tea and stare out into the ocean. She used to say the sea calmed her. I think she was reliving memories now you've told us your story." There was another silence, and then, hesitantly, Brett addressed the elephant in the room. How is she? Does she ever?" he said, looking at the ground, almost afraid of the answer. "Well, she's fine. Older, I'm sure. But Mummy always did look after herself. She's quite a spry 48-year-old. Did you know we are the exact same age as she was when she met you?" Brett just stared at Amelia. There was an uncomfortable silence. Bradley shifted and then spoke. "Actually, now that Daddy's gone, she's decided to step back from public life. She's now the official title holder. Or was, anyway." "Was?" asked Brett, looking over at Bradley. "Yes, she abdicated her title. Passed it on down. Retiring from public life is a euphemism for letting go of the title and passing it down." "So, you are now the Duke?" asked Brett. "Yes, for my sins. I was born 12 minutes before Millie. So now I'm the Lord of the Manor, His Grace, the Duke of Ipswich," answered Bradley simply. "Am I supposed to call you my lord or bow or curtsy or something?" said Brett, pursing his lips. He had no idea if his kids had his same sense of humour. Time to find out. "Well, strictly speaking, according to protocol," started Amelia. "Yeah, I seem to recall us colonials having a little war with your lot so we wouldn't have to bow and scrape and all that crap," interrupted Brett dryly. "Yes, well, of course," said Amelia, cheeks a little red, evidently embarrassed. Bradley just grinned at her, obviously enjoying her discomfort, as siblings are wont to do. There was another silence. "So where do we go from here?" asked Brett, getting up to get another beer. "I mean, you came to see me. I know you exist. Now what?" "Well," said Amelia, exchanging a glance with Bradley, "we were hoping to get to you. I mean, it would be nice to know some family history, you know. Any uncles or aunts or cousins out there for us to meet?" asked Amelia, half hopefully. "Friad not, only child. My parents died when I was 17, so there's just me." "Well, not anymore," smiled Amelia, and it went through Brett like a knife. So much like her mother. Won't that be a bit, awkward? Long-lost daddy shows up from the US. I mean, won't that impact your titles? Brett wanted to know, settling back into his chair after passing a bottle to both his children. His brain had started working again, seeing the bigger picture. His children. Jesus. Well, I hope you understand, Dad. We can't go around admitting this. In terms of the title, well, stuff like this is as much part of the royal family as crowns and pomp and ceremony. I mean, anyone who really thinks that Harry is really Charles' biological son. Amelia trailed off as she saw Bradley shaking his head vigorously at her. Anyway, she said after a second, trying to get back on track, the palace will just simply issue a denial if it comes out, and that'll be that. Short of a DNA test, that's the end of it. They just ignore it. It's what the royal family are very good at doing, unfortunately. So not really worried there, as long as we don't flaunt it. That does mean, added Bradley, we can't officially recognise you, Dad. There's no point in waving a red flag either. Neither one of us particularly want to flaunt what happened with Mother all those years ago, and I'm sure she doesn't either. With that in mind, I hope you aren't really looking to make a big deal out of all this. If I was, do you think I would have let your mother walk away? Demanded Brett. No, quite. Point taken, answered Amelia quietly. It is a big deal, though. To me, muttered Brett. Yes, I can imagine. Us too. We spent the entire flight talking about it, wondering who you are, reading Mum's dossier over and over, and thankfully you really are everything we had hoped. Right, Brad? Definitely, agreed Bradley firmly. Great taste in beer too, he said, holding up his almost finished bottle. Well, that's nice. I warn you though, I really know nothing about being a dad. Never figured it was on the cards for me. Don't worry, we'll guide you through it, Amelia said, leaning forward to take his hand again. One thing though. Please, while our father was never really that available, or there that much, he did his best, so please, don't disparage him. That would mean we couldn't be around you, and no one wants that. Oh please, the man was a saint. I am just jealous he got you and your mother for all those years, said Brett emphatically. Nothing but respect here. He paused, then asked gently, Do you think he knew? Well, Dad wasn't the most present person when it came to family, to be frank. I don't think he really had a clue what to do as a father either. But like Millie said, he did his best. Tried to steer us right, have the talks he thought we needed to have, made sure he turned up for music recitals and so on. But where he really excelled was at running the estate. He was a whiz with animal husbandry, for example, so I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if the heterochromia in our eyes tipped him off. But if it did, he never said a word to us, or loved us any less than he was capable. For that alone, he deserves respect, said Bradley, reflectively. To the Duke, said Brett, raising his bottle. May a good man rest in peace. Hear, hear, agreed Amelia, and they all three raised their bottles. They all took a long drink and sat for a moment, each with their own thoughts. So, are you in town for long? What does your mother think about you coming to see me? Asked Brett conversationally without thinking, more for something to say to break the awkward silence than anything. Well, since we are now the official royal representatives, we have to go home as soon as possible, I'm afraid. Mummy has moved out of the main house and into one of the small cottages on the estate. It's all up to us now, so we have to be around and be seen. Plus, I have a practice to get back to, answered Amelia. Practice? Inquired Brett, interested. Yes, I'm a solicitor. Lawyer, you'd say. First year of it, at a local group. Lots of pro bono work, local land trusts, things like that. Brad is now the lord of the manor, and his full-time work is now the duchy. But, interjected Bradley, we'd like to extend an invitation for you to come visit. Have a holiday. Spend some time with us, so you can see our lives. And we'd rather like to portion some time to come out here and see how you live, if that's okay. Brett shrugged. Well, yeah. I mean, of course, I just don't want to make it awkward. With your mother, I mean. there as yet another meaningful glance between the two of them. "Dad," said Amelia carefully, "I know Mum was the love of your life. Well, like I said, she's decided to take a step back from public life. It's a totally understood thing. Lost her husband, so she'll wear her tweeds and do her gardening and just retreat a bit. Happens all the time in our strand of society, and to do that she's going to just take off for a bit." Amelia was clearly groping for words, constantly looking back at her brother for encouragement and confirmation of what she was saying. Bradley was nodding at her, clearly sympathetic to her phrasing. "She's decided to take a cruise. She says she has wonderful memories of some time spent at sea." Amelia was concentrating on Brett as she spoke, watching and evaluating his response to her words. "For 6 months, around the world. She's booked a suite, quite one of the nicest on the ship in fact. 2 bedrooms, private deck, steward, the whole deal." "Okay," said Brett, not following. "And it leaves in 2 days?" "From San Diego." There was a suddenly silence as Brett's eyes bulged and understanding flowed into him. "She's here," he said, abruptly standing up. "Now?" Amelia grinned at Bradley and then smiled even wider at her father. "A hotel downtown, the Coronado. We are staying there too." Brett looked wildly around. "She wants to see me? Me?" "Well, as long as you have your passport, I think the idea was that you might want to join her. You've got nothing going on that you can't leave, right?" Brett fell back into the chair. "This is for real, right? She's here?" Amelia nodded vigorously. "And waiting for you, if you want, Dad." "She's here," Brett muttered to himself. "I've got to pack, get the house shut up. I need to go. Do you think it would be okay if I just showed up? What should I wear?" He was babbling now. Amelia glanced at Bradley, who was also grinning broadly. "I think it would be more than okay, Dad." Brett stood outside the hotel room door, nervous despite himself. 25 years. He'd travelled the world, seen storms and other things, experienced what life had to offer, and yet what was inside this room terrified him. Something, no someone, he desperately wanted. He raised his hand to knock, but before he could land his hand, the door opened. And there she was, a little aged, but the same woman. Same eyes, same porcelain skin, some crows and wrinkles, but the same smile, same inviting mouth, same everything. It made his pulse race, just looking at her. "Hello, sailor. Ready to pick up where we left off?" "Oh God, yes," thought Brett. All things come to those who wait.